I'm Allison Kemmerer. I'm the Mary Strip and R. Crosby Kemper Director of the Addison Gallery of American Art. Welcome. We really appreciate your presence here. We know we're competing with just lazy Sunday, but also the eclipse. So thank you for choosing to be with us. I'd first like to begin by recognizing that we are on native land. We acknowledge Phillips Academy's presence on land once inhabited by the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples, as well as the modern-day Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. Phillips Academy honors all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. Again, thank you for being with us. Your presence is deeply appreciated. Before I acknowledge just some of the many hands and minds that helped make today's event happen, I wanted to briefly explain how this all came to be. The Addison is one of 6 institutions, art institutions, invited by Colby Museum of Art's Lunder Institute to participate in their new initiative called Lunder At. By developing a public program that responds to the question, what is the state of American art? We were honored to be included in this impressive group that includes the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, the Broad in Los Angeles, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Arkansas, our neighbors, the MFA Boston, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. At the same time, we felt that as a museum that was conceived of from the very start to focus solely on American art, we were perfectly suited to explore this question. And Erica Wall, the director of the Lunder Institute, has stated that when asking this question, what is the state of American art, we are really asking what is the state of America, regionally, nationally, and globally. And in fact, over the past few years, we've been using the question, what is America, to guide the growth of our collection and our programming. We, of course, realize that there's no singular answer to this question, as it involves many perspectives and voices that in turn are constantly evolving. Still, we think it's a critical one to keep asking as we strive to continuously expand the museum's ability to present a fuller range of art and a more textured story of the American experience. The Lunder invitation inspired us to apply these same questions to not only the present, but to our past, which led us down this wonderful rabbit hole of questioning and critical thinking. What was the state of American art when the museum was established and opened its doors in 1931? As Gordon will discuss, Gordon Wilkins, Addison curator, in his presentation, the establishment of the Addison Gallery came with a clearly delineated definition of American art, one that's contingent upon citizenship. What was the context that led to that definition? How has it morphed over time? How does it inform how we function today, and how do we move forward? The resulting 2-part symposium takes the Addison's own formation as a case study and a springboard to track evolving conceptions of American art over the last century, with special attention to questions of citizenship and national identity as they inform the field today. We're so grateful to the Lunder Institute for giving us this opportunity to use our own history to think about the larger scope of American art, its past, its present, and its future. And we thank them for their support throughout the whole planning process. I also want to thank Phillips Academy faculty members Corey Martin and Hector Membrano Canales for their work in coordinating student participation. I want to thank the Addison team for tending to the myriad details that went into organizing this event, particularly Jamie Gibbons, Angela Parker, Anna Gessing, Rebecca Mongen, and Julianne McDonough. Thanks go to Addison curators Gordon Wilkins and especially Rachel Vogel for not only playing a critical role in creating the framework for these 2 panels, but for also serving as panelists themselves. And finally, I want to thank our guest panelists, who I've met most of you, but not all of you yet. Hardeep Dillon, Miguel Luciano, Andrew McClellan, Marina Tykenko, and Stephanie Sparling-Williams. Your time, expertise, and insights are deeply appreciated, and I know will inspire a day of thought-provoking and generative conversation. So thank you. Hopefully you all have programs, here they are, But just a quick overview of today's schedule. Our first panel will go until 2. We will then have an hour-long break. Refreshments will be served in the lobby, and we invite you to enjoy them in the adjacent Underwood room while visiting with our student exhibitors. 2, I think, are over here, who will share their own artwork that explores different facets of the American experience. The museum is open, and you're also welcome to view our exhibitions during the break. Panel 2 will begin at 3 o'clock sharp and end at 4:30, after which you'll be invited back to the museum for a reception. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Erica Wall, the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College.
Thank you so much, Allison. And thanks to all of you for being here and taking your Sunday to enjoy this amazing symposium. As Allison had pointed out, this is the 4th of 6 programs that make up the launch of Lunder Institute at. And Lunder Institute for American Art, for all intents and purposes, is a think tank, a very unique and special entity that is a think tank for the museum, but also for the field of American art. And in being that, it requires that we look at what we do broadly. And so the idea of Lunder Institute at was to create a vehicle for conversation between art institutions to really address all of the things that we do. Another thing that the Lunder Institute is a compass. And it's a compass that doesn't just direct us toward one North Star, but to a galaxy of stars that we have yet to explore. And that exploration requires questioning, much of which we'll do here today. And so with that, partnership is also required. So I wanted to take an opportunity to thank the Addison Gallery of American Art for being a partner with the Lunder Institute for American Art. And I specifically wanted to thank its director, Allison Kremerer, and the amazing staff and faculty, but also curators Gordon Wilkins and Rachel Vogel, but also the students at Phillips Academy Andover who participated in this collaboration to bring together a program that I know is going to be amazing. But I also want to take, again, an opportunity to thank Peter and Paula Lunder and the Lunder Foundation for making the Lunder Institute for American Art possible and to create this platform and this vehicle for us to be in conversation, not just to benefit the Colby community, but as we can see today, to benefit communities beyond our borders so that we can all share in conversation that moves the field forward. So without further ado, again, I want to thank all of you, but I want to invite you to enjoy with me this amazing program today. Thank you so much.
Hi and welcome. As Ali mentioned, the Lunder Institute's invitation provided an opportunity to critically revisit the Addison's definition of American art, which traces back to our 1930 terms of trust. So the speakers in our first panel today help contextualize that moment of the Addison's founding by situating it within broader discourses of what it meant to be an American and the status of American art in American museums. Our first speaker is Hardeep Dhillon. Dhillon is the child of immigrants, a storyteller, and a historian. She's currently assistant professor in Asian American history and core faculty in the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also a member of the Penn Migration Initiative Executive Committee. Professor Dhillon's research focuses on the history of immigration to the United States and the laws and legal practices that shape immigrant lives. Her current book project, tentatively titled America's Modern Immigrant Family, studies the legal construction of the modern immigrant family through the lens of Asian American history. Please join me in welcoming Hardeep Dhillon to the stage.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with all of you on a Sunday, and it's particularly lovely to have folks come on a Sunday. I want to extend my thanks to Gordon Wilkins for the invitation to come, Karen Platt, and also to Rachel Vogel for really fielding all of my queries and my presence here today. I also want to offer a land acknowledgement, a settler acknowledgement. I live and work in Philadelphia now, and I offer my greatest thanks and solidarity to the Lenape people, who are the original inhabitants of Philadelphia. I also look forward to learning with all of you today, learning with and from you. And today I've been asked to reflect on the 1930 terms of trust with the Addison Gallery of American Art, which established a citizenship-dependent acquisition policy. What I want to do today is to provide a crucial historical context to understand who had access to U.S. citizenship, who naturalized, and who did not, and what that history can mean both for the past and the present. I'm going to present a few slides. They're mostly visual in nature with very little text. We're not all here for a timeline with lengthy text, but what I do want to show is the foundational history that shapes legal and bureaucratic practices around U.S. citizenship in this country. So the history of naturalization policy in the United States looks very simple at its core. The earliest naturalization policy in the United States was actually issued in 1790 as the U.S. came out of the Revolutionary War, and there was an amendment to that first policy which restricted naturalization to free white persons of good moral character, meaning there was a racial prerequisite on your ability to naturalize in the United States. There was also a moral prerequisite to naturalization. The only change that emerged in the next 100 to 150 years to this policy happened right after the Civil War, with questions about whether folks who were formerly enslaved in the United States and those who were migrating to the United States should be eligible to naturalize. The only change to that policy was that in addition to individuals who were white, individuals who were of African ancestry and nativity were able to naturalize. That was the single concession to naturalization policy that emerged in the wake of Reconstruction. That issue posed, those sorts of restrictions on U.S. citizenship posed great questions for the United States, particularly as the demographic makeup of immigrants who are arriving in the United States started to change. The first major questions related to who could or should not be able to naturalize came really with Asian immigrants in the wake of 1870, as a larger group of Asian immigrants from all parts of Asia started to move to the United States. The largest group among these immigrants were immigrants from China and really the southern province of China. And there was almost immediate backlash to Asian immigrants in the United States. America's modern problem of immigration is usually imagined in relationship to Central and South American immigration. When you think about the immigrant problem in American policy today, the first image, whether anyone wants to admit it or not, is usually of someone of Latinx ancestry. That wasn't true in the late 19th century or the early 20th century. The immigration problem was the Asian problem. And these images sort of reflect on how that problem manifested in the press. These images were not just canonical in everyday cartoons, but actually in everyday newspapers across the country. There was a huge concern that Asian immigrants not only represented a racial threat to the demographic makeup of the United States, but also an economic threat, a religious threat, and a civilizational threat to the United States. And there were laws put in place across the country, both at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, prohibiting all sorts of basic rights. In California, for example, where many Chinese immigrants came to mine gold, there were extensive tax policies put in place and leveraged against Chinese immigrants to force them out of certain industries. Images like this one here labeled at the bottom as the Chinese must go were fairly common in the press. And there was a very strong, violent anti-Chinese movement that involved multiple drive-outs where Chinese immigrants were literally moved from their beds in the middle of the night, from workplaces in the middle of the day, led to train stations or harbors, and pushed out of the local jurisdictions that they were in. In some places, there were also lynchings. So we're talking about an intense amount of racial violence. And it didn't just target adult men, it also targeted families. There are also local boycotts and drive-outs, showing you the way in which this violence was quite localized and enforced not just by everyday nativists in the legislature, but also by everyday individuals who harbored anti-Asian viewpoints. That violence was quite instructive. It was constructive enough that violence coming out of the U.S. West led the United States to issue its first major anti-immigration policy at the federal scale, banning a singular group from the United States. Those were Chinese Americans. All Chinese nationals, with the exception of merchant students and a few other categories, were prohibited from the United States between 1875 and the 1890s until the middle of the 20th century. But those early stipulations on U.S. citizenship around race also begged new questions of where Asian immigrants stood on the racial spectrum in the United States. As I mentioned, federal naturalization law restricted U.S. citizenship to individuals who were free white persons or individuals of African ancestry and nativity. So where did Asians fit on that spectrum? Given that the stipulations for those who were not white were limited to African ancestry and nativity, which denotes that you have to be from Africa to prove that you can qualify for that status, most Asian immigrants leveraged that they were white in U.S. courts to naturalize in the United States. Today, this may sound bizarre because our racial categories look very different. But if you're an immigrant in the United States and the two options that are open to you were the options that were open to Asian immigrants, you can see why they opted to position themselves as white. There were a number of ways in which Asian immigrants and courts tried to determine whether Asian immigrants were white. They relied on anthropological ethnographic science, philology, the color of their skin, their decorum. So if you're an Asian immigrant of a higher class status, your ability to speak English well, and you moved in certain Christian networks, you were probably much more likely to get a sympathetic judge who would naturalize you. Whereas most working class Asian immigrants were held outside of the bounds of U.S. citizenship. But as Asian immigrants started to go to the courts to naturalize, the question arose whether they qualified as white or not. And there were multiple precedents denoting Asian immigrants are white or not across the United States, not just in the U.S. West, where Asian immigrants migrated in the largest numbers, but also across the Atlantic seaboard and the U.S. South, where some started to naturalize as early as the mid to late 19th century. I want to backtrack here very quickly because I forgot to mention something very significant. Most of you may be familiar with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. That is the act that barred the first national community from the United States targeting Chinese immigrants. Another stipulation in that act was Chinese immigrants were not allowed to naturalize. So you could come here as an adult immigrant or you could come here as a child with your parents, and no matter how long you lived, if you were an individual of Chinese ancestry, you were not legally eligible to naturalize. But these questions around who was white or not started to pick up with greater fervor in the 1910s and the 1920s. Why? Because many states started to stipulate what are called citizen-only laws. Access to resources, everything from your ability to join a professional organization to holding what we now know as a white-collared profession, such as in law, in medicine, even to teach in the classroom, all started to become prefaced on your legal status and your eligibility for U.S. citizenship. And as these sorts of citizen-only laws started to proliferate really across the United States in every jurisdiction imaginable, there were questions about whether Asian immigrants qualified for U.S. citizenship or not. And there was pressure both from local communities and by federal courts to finally make a decision on whether Asian immigrants were white or not. Well, the Supreme Court decided to hear those questions in the 1920s. In 1922 and 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court deemed Asian immigrants ineligible for naturalization based on the consensus that they were not white. The Supreme Court ruled between these two hearings, representing the two men on the screen, Toke-Izawa and Puget Singh Thind, that Asian immigrants were not white on the basis of their skin color, on the basis of their decorum, on the basis of ancestral heritage, on the basis of race science, et cetera, et cetera. The courts, the same court really, in those 2 years, ruled out every possibility of Asian immigrants to naturalize in the United States. And with nowhere to go but the courts for refuge, Asian immigrants were left with no pathway to U.S. citizenship. So the largest community in the United States with no pathway to U.S. citizenship, again, regardless of how long you lived here. This didn't just affect everyday immigrants that were coming to the United States. It also trickled down into the family domain in very significant ways. On my right, there is a family of the Bagai family. After the Supreme Court decision in 1923, where Asian immigrants were deemed ineligible to naturalize, the father in this image decides to commit suicide. He takes his own life because so much of his life in the U.S. had been prefaced on the possibility of having and retaining U.S. citizenship. He lost his business, the home that he had acquired in the United States, and when he had arrived, he had sold all his belongings in India to be able to build his life in the U.S. In addition to the loss of citizenship for Asian immigrants, anyone who was married to an Asian immigrant at the time also lost their status as a U.S. citizen, if that person you were married to was male. And this is because for a long time, the United States, really until the 1930s, held policies that basically made the status of women's nationality dependent on their fathers and their husbands. So even if you were a birthright citizen and you were a woman, if you married someone who was ineligible to naturalize, which was racially coded as Asian, you would lose your status as a U.S. citizen. So the other image in this screen is of Sakaram Ganesh Pandit and his wife, and she actually lost her status as a U.S. citizen for a short amount of time before she regained it as policy changes were made in the 1920s. So you can see the way in which the question of citizenship is not just a question of immigration, it's also a significant question about gender and family. So these are the basic naturalization policies that were in place in the late 19th and early 20th century as we're moving into the 1930s. The other big issue that popped up around U.S. citizenship was the question of birthright. Those of you who may be U.S. history buffs, you may recognize the slide to the right. It's an image of Wong Kim Ark, a Chinese immigrant who traveled to China in 1894, traveled back in 1895, and he was born a U.S. citizen in San Francisco. Immigration authorities hold him at the border and declare that he's not a U.S. citizen because his parents are ineligible to naturalize as U.S. citizens. You can sort of track back the policies that many conservative policymakers in the U.S. today who are gutting for birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants are parents who are ineligible to naturalize to this moment with Wong Kim Ark, to really Asian American history. In Wong Kim Ark's case, the Supreme Court actually was very wary that if they restricted Chinese or individuals of Chinese ancestry who held birthright citizenship, if they stripped them of birthright citizenship, it would actually affect all children whose parents were not U.S. citizens. And there was a huge concern of that effect on children who were of European ancestry. So in Wong Kim Ark's case, the U.S. Supreme Court actually decided to uphold the principle of birthright citizenship. But that didn't mean that attempts to strip birthright citizenship for children who were racialized went away. In fact, as I've mentioned, even to this day, there's efforts to strip birthright citizenship from children who are born to non-citizens. And those efforts actually continued well into the 1920s, with the main target being the children of Japanese immigrants, as you see in this image on the screen. And it was really because there was a huge fear that Japanese immigrants in the United States were a socioeconomic threat to white families, that the Japanese as an empire was expanding across the Pacific, was a geopolitical threat to the United States, but also Japanese Americans were socioeconomically far too mobile compared to other immigrant communities. Those efforts largely failed, but I do want to talk about the way in which, even though the courts upheld the principle of birthright citizenship, children who were born to non-citizens actually experienced the trickle-down effect of their parents being prohibited from U.S. citizenship. And so what I have on the slide is an excerpt from a memoir from Grétard Delon, No Relationship, although we share the same surname. And I think what the quote really gets at is, you may be able to hold U.S. citizenship, but if your parents in this period of the 1920s are unable to hold U.S. citizenship, it meant that they were also unable to buy a home or to hold property in their name. And the impact of that on children was profound. For this young woman, it didn't just mean that she didn't have a home that she can walk to and from quite regularly. It meant that she was constantly shifting schools because her parents were in precarious economic positions and had to shift work all the time. I want to shift very briefly into speaking about something that we speak very little about when we talk about U.S. history and citizenship, which is the history of empire. So there's questions about immigration to the United States and its relationship to U.S. citizenship, who's eligible to naturalize, who is not. But there's also questions about what happens when the U.S. expanded its empire into the Pacific and into the Caribbean, and the sorts of populations that came under U.S. control in the late 19th century. This image sort of speaks for itself, so I won't say too much, but the question that emerged as the U.S. moved into the Pacific and the Caribbean in the 1890s and won, quote unquote, new territories and colonies in the Spanish-American War was the question of what would happen to those individuals. Would they become a part of the body of citizens that represented the United States, or would they not? And actually what the courts and legislators in the U.S. did was in some ways quite legally ingenious and other ways very insidious. They created a series of categories that were neither alien, which is the category that was used for non-citizens, and neither citizen. A new set of categories emerged to determine the legal status or delineate the legal status of newly colonized subjects everywhere from Puerto Rico to the Philippines. And that was to ensure that the racial makeup of the United States didn't change, but also so new imperial subjects who were colonized did not have the same rights as U.S. citizens. The U.S. still holds most of these colonies to this day. And then the other question that emerges with the question of empire is really in relationship to settler colonialism is what happens to Native history. Historically, Native communities have been declared domestic dependent nations of the United States, and the legal status given to Native communities was that of wards, so they were not U.S. citizens. And if someone wanted to qualify for U.S. citizenship through various piecemeal laws, they often had to get rid of some of their landholdings and assimilate into quote-unquote American culture and American civilization. That process became very robust in the 1920s, where Native children were moved from their homes into boarding schools through heavily racialized policies that sought to, quote unquote, assimilate them into American culture. The United States is still digging up the mass graves that resulted from this project to this very day. And then finally, I'm going to take you into the 1930s and then conclude very briefly. As Addison's policy went into effect in the 1930s, it was really where the notion of America for Americans was gaining fervor again. Most of you are familiar with something called the Great Depression. The 1930s was the era of the Great Depression. And the phrase America for Americans was really everywhere, from local newspaper headings to State of Union speeches to everyday pamphlets related to who the state was going to aid and the new policies that were coming out under the Hoover and the Roosevelt administrations. But in the 1930s, the biggest mass deportation of U.S. citizens occurred in the United States. The U.S. moved or coerced roughly anywhere between 1 to 2 million individuals of Mexican ancestry. I want to highlight that these are individuals of Mexican ancestry. They are not Mexican. A huge number of them were U.S. citizens. The largest number of individuals moved out at this time were children, and in that category of children, most were birthright citizens. In this, the reason why individuals of Mexican ancestry were targeted was because it was an easy scapegoat. You can move them across the border very quickly and in trains. So it was a cheap way of purging a huge population. And so this is really the backdrop of Addison's policy around citizenship. I'm going to take one more minute to conclude. I know I'm over time by a minute. If there are some takeaways I'd like you to take home, it's these. The United States has restricted its naturalization of immigrants on the basis of race until the 1950s. The policies around whiteness did not go away until the 1950s. There have been ways in which legal status, without mentioning race explicitly, right? Those 1910s, 1920s laws I shared with you on the screen, using legal status was actually the way in which people were able to instrumentalize racially coded laws without violating the 14th Amendment in the wake of abolition. And then the other takeaways I'd like you to take home is that restrictions on imperial subjects continue. Some colonized areas have individuals who have been declared U.S. citizens, but without the same rights as U.S. citizens on the mainland, but also that not all individuals who hold U.S. citizenship today have necessarily wanted it. As I've tried to highlight, particularly with the history of empire off the U.S. mainland, but also in relationship to Native communities, the relationship between imperial subjects and citizenship has been deeply contested. And then finally, beyond these two historical takeaways, I'd like this audience to really meditate on whether citizenship status in a world where access to citizenship, the length of time one waits, the financial costs, and the bureaucratic measures one has to move through have greatly expanded. Moreover, we are in an era where non-citizen populations, including but not limited to undocumented immigrants, has risen. To what degree, then, does U.S. citizenship make someone American or define American art or the American experience or even American history more than non-citizens? And then more provocatively, but really not that provocative, to what degree have non-citizens and citizens on the margins made the American experience, made American art and history in fundamental ways that compel us to shift our very definition of who or what is American? Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Hardeep. Our next panelist is Andrew McClellan, who is the professor of art history at Tufts University and the author of numerous books and articles on the history of museums and collecting, including Inventing the Louvre, the Art Museum from Boulay to Bilbao, and The Art of Curating, Paul Sachs and the Museum Course at Harvard. His current book project is Rivals on the Fenway, Isabella Stewart Gardner, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Destiny of the American Art Museum. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and everyone for coming out today. And thanks, Hardeep, that was fascinating. My father was half Japanese immigrant to this country in 1952, and he never became a citizen, and I've never really thought about why that might be. Anyway, let's move on. Very good. So in my talk today, I'm hoping it will be helpful to provide some historical context for the emergence of the Addison Gallery by looking at the introduction of American art at the two most prominent art museums in the United States at the start of the 20th century. That's to say, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The purpose of my brief remarks is to suggest that the stature and precedence of these two museums conditioned public expectations and established a paradigm for other museums that followed in their wake. Let's look first at the Boston MFA. When, in the first decade of the 20th century, the MFA moved from its original location in Copley Square to land bordering Olmsted's Emerald Necklace in the Fenway, it occasioned a comprehensive rethink of the museum's means and ends, its external design and internal organization, its collecting priorities, staffing, and public relations. The extent and depth of museological inquiry was unprecedented. Treating the new building as a tabula rasa, the aim was to define the key features of a fine arts museum for a new century. In 1902, senior leadership toured 100 museums in Europe and the US in hopes of emulating what was working and avoiding what was not. At home, other staff conducted a methodical review of the literature in multiple languages. Harvard and MIT lent expertise on architecture, lighting, and layout. After its inauguration in 1909, the new MFA was hailed as a pioneering model on both sides of the Atlantic. The essence of what was then called the Boston idea revolved around the following points. 1, the primary goal of a public museum was to foster art appreciation in the general population. Only secondarily should it serve scholars and artists. 2, the chief criterion for acquisition and exhibition must be aesthetic quality. 3, art museums differ from other kinds of museums in privileging looking. From these priorities, critical design features were logically entailed. The collection was divided in two. A selection of artworks deemed of superior quality, led by the so-called high arts of painting and sculpture, was displayed for accessible viewing by the general public in simple, well-lighted galleries on the main floor, as you see in the top slide on the left. A larger number of lesser objects was housed in the storage study rooms for researchers below, bottom left, and you can quite clearly see the difference. Complementing a qualitative separation of objects was a horizontal distribution of core collections across the museum's footprint, resulting in 3 self-contained units supervised by specialist curators. One wing was dedicated to Asian art, another to classical antiquities, and a third to Western paintings. Connecting corridors featured a sampling of the decorative arts. While hailed for its innovative vision, the MFA's new design had significant implications for American art. With quality as the benchmark, meaning for all Western art, quality judged against canonical European standards, little more than high-style painting of the 18th and 19th centuries made the cut. Of the applied arts or decorative arts on view, only a small selection of Paul Revere's silver was judged worthy of promotion in the early guidebook. You see that on the right. Now, it was acknowledged that a wider sampling of colonial arts and crafts would be worth preserving for historical interest, but that had to wait until a new decorative arts wing was added in 1927, and even then it was relegated to the depths of the basement. Furthermore, the adoption of typological and qualitative hierarchies not only pushed colonial production to the edge of the frame, it eliminated Native American visual culture altogether. As part and parcel of the ranking process that happened with the new building, indigenous objects were transferred to the Peabody Museum at Harvard. Parallel to the sorting of individual collections, the late 19th century witnessed a broader shaping of the museum landscape, with separate museums devoted to art, science, history, and ethnology coming online. Today, as we embrace greater and more global interdisciplinarity, we must navigate the repercussions of these century-old taxonomic imperatives. Back to the MFA. Even as it tightened its internal borders, it spread its gatekeeping authority beyond the museum's walls by establishing in 1910 a registry of local art, which included buildings, monuments, paintings, and sculptures esteemed worthy of public exhibition. The noble purpose of the enterprise was to encourage appreciation of art in the public realm that might go unnoticed, or in its own words, to keep the artistic inheritance of the people before the public mind. One does wonder how much local communities cared about receiving the museum's stamp of approval, or if a public artwork was ever rejected. That would be an interesting list. But the point is that in construing the registry as an outdoor department of the museum, the MFA solidified a narrow top-down definition of what qualified as art in the public imagination. Now, moving on to New York, the MFA's initial neglect of Americana redounded to the benefit of the Met. In 1909, the year the MFA opened, its New York rival hosted the landmark Hudson Fulton exhibition, a pioneering survey of American decorative arts and design from the first colonial settlers to the early 19th century, built around the furniture collection of a Boston lawyer, Eugene Bowles. Missed opportunity for the MFA. The exhibition marked the anniversary of Henry Hudson's exploration of the river named after him and Robert Fulton's invention of the steamboat that opened the North American continent to trade and development. Against the background of late 19th century immigration and the threatened dilution of Anglo-Saxon mores, the stated purpose of the celebration was to, I quote, was to generate love of country, civic pride, and loyalty to established institutions, to bind a people together, make it more homogeneous and give it stability, and to make inhabitants better citizens by holding to their lofty eyes traditions to enlist their affections and inspire their emulation. End of quote. The enormous success of the Hudson Fulton exhibition led directly to the creation 15 years later of the Met's American Wing. Opened in 1924, the new wing narrated the history of the colonial, revolutionary, and federal periods through household objects displayed chronologically on 3 floors and featuring reconstructed period environments from New England and the mid-Atlantic states. Though it largely eschewed the high arts of painting and sculpture, the American Wing was ever conscious of the canon and qualitative inferiority relative to European standards. The Wing's chief curator, R.T.H. Halsey, you see on the right, could not have been clearer on that score when he wrote, "No claim is made that colonial art is great art. From the art standpoint, it cannot be compared with that of Raphael, Michelangelo, Cellini, and numerous others. Instead, the human side of the American wing is the great attraction. And for this reason, much American history, economic, social, and political, has been woven into our story. End of quote. In other words, storytelling more than isolated scrutiny of high art was the focus. And predictably, the story was one of colonial progress and civilization. In the words of the critic Royal Cortisone, to explore the American wing is to apprehend in singular vividness the spirit in which those men who made the colonies and who founded the Republic lived their lives at home and superimposed urbanity upon the site of primeval wilderness. End of quote. Native Americans were referenced only as the unwilling or vanishing subjects of settler colonialism. Now, if American art fell short of Raphael and Michelangelo, the new wing nevertheless set out to demonstrate a steady advance in artistic refinement from humble beginnings to an eventual mastery of form deserving of admiration. The chronological ordering of the wing started with the simple dwellings of the 17th century on the top floor, to your left, and worked down to the stylistic high watermark and comfortable luxury of the Revolutionary and Federal periods on floors below. Underscored by the imposing facade of the Wall Street branch bank, which we just saw on the last slide. By the time visitors reached the ground level rooms dedicated to the work of Paul Revere, Samuel McIntyre, and Duncan Phyfe, whose work you see in set, they were made conscious of American design having reached a level of sophistication comparable to, and yet subtly independent from, European art. To secure the effect of parity, Halsey insisted that, quote, only the most beautiful rooms and things which have class need be included. The exhibition of the quaint and the curious should be left to our historical museums, he added. Needless to say, the emphasis on beauty, quality, and class skewed the narrative on view toward elite patronage and production. The intended message of the American wing was twofold. On one hand, it assimilated American art into the arc of progress inherited from European historiography. In other words, it made a bold statement for American equality. On the other hand, it naturalized the taste of old Yankee stock as the driving force of American art. That hereditary cast included the museum's sponsors, donors, and curators. When the Met's president, Robert DeForest, remarked at the opening that the new wing honored, quote, our fathers and our mothers, our grandfathers and our grandmothers, he meant that quite literally. But more than filial piety was at stake. The galleries opened amidst continued anxiety, as Hardeep has shown us, about the erosion of patrician values brought on by mass immigration and modernization. In effect, the new wing made permanent the ideological aims of the earlier Hudson Fulton exhibition. Halsey's speech at the inauguration explicitly linked the new wing to a desired Americanization of new immigrants. He wrote, much of America today has lost sight of its traditions. Many of our people are not cognizant of our traditions and the principles for which our fathers struggled and died. The tremendous changes in the character of our nation and the influx of foreign ideas utterly at variance with those held by the men who gave us the Republic threaten, and unless checked, may shake its foundations. Royal Cortisone affirmed that the wing delivered, as he put it, an educational value beyond measure. It's hard not to hear reverberations of those anxieties in the political discourse of our own time. But sticking with museums and American art, What may we point to as the enduring effects of the foundational paradigms I've outlined today? As I see it, the inheritance of European ideas about what constitutes art and how to organize museums had the following consequences. It promoted the so-called high arts of painting and sculpture over other media and inevitably forced qualitative comparison with the Western canon. Competition with Europe also skewed the display of the decorative arts in the direction of elite taste, which in any case aligned with the class interests of patrician donors. These overlapping layers of aesthetic bias, once baked into the spatial arrangement and collecting horizons of our museums, have made it difficult to mount alternative histories of American art. Furthermore, the structural and conceptual precedence given to looking and visuality now poses a challenge to the recent turn toward storytelling, or to paraphrase Stephen Weil, the shift from museums being about the things they own to being for the communities they serve. Lastly, the backward-looking canonical outlook of our first encyclopedic museums excluded contemporary art and left them reluctant to engage in artistic experimentation. However, of course, all challenges should simultaneously be seen as opportunities. Over time, new museums, including the Whitney, Museum of Modern Art, and the Addison, came along to expand existing paradigms, and all the while, new generations of curators arise to rethink established ways of being. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And for our final panelist for the first panel, we have Gordon Wilkins, the Robert M. Walker Curator of American Art at the Addison Gallery of American Art. Wilkins oversees the care, exhibition, and growth of the Addison's world-renowned collection of American art across media, with a particular focus on the art of the 19th and early 20th centuries. He's curated numerous exhibitions on a broad array of topics, ranging from European American perceptions of the natural world in the 19th century to 1970s Bay Area conceptual photography. He was also the curator of the critically acclaimed Rosamond Purcell Nature Stands Aside, the first retrospective exhibition devoted to this pioneering photographer and conceptual artist. The accompanying publication, edited by Wilkins, was named one of this season's outstanding art books by Book Forum and was highlighted by Lucy Sant as one of the best photography books of 2022 in the New York Times. Gordon, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much to Andrew and particularly Hardeep for setting me up so well for this very navel-gazing portion of the program. Because we're going to look at the Addison's history as a quite instructive case study. So as you ascend the steps leading to the imposing temple front portico of Charles Platt's fairly conservative and muted Georgian Revival building, one that conveys this sense of fixity and permanence, if you're craning your neck the right way and you look up at the pediment, you'll see inscribed Respice Artem Patriae, which unfortunately will not be the only Latin phrase I drop during this presentation. That loosely translates to regard the art of country. Of course, there's the question of whose country, which is something that I'll continue to explore as we continue along. The Addison, as we know it, was the vision of Thomas Cochrane, an 1890 graduate of Phillips Academy who originally hailed from St. Paul, Minnesota. He led quite a colorful career here at Andover. He was known for various hijinks. He was accused at one point of visiting a bordello. And those hijinks continued on during his time, as all good Andover men would do at Yale. There's a very famous, famous enough to make it into his New York Times obituary, episode that involved him stealing a cast iron dog that the New York Times wrote in his 1936 obituary incurred his aesthetic displeasure. He hoisted and bolted down this quote unquote monstrosity in garden decorations to the college belfry. He was also a very difficult figure to pin down. He was prone to bouts of what we would likely consider mania, and launched toward the end of his life into one of the most transformative philanthropic efforts of the 20th century, which was his complete reconception of Phillips Academy. He attempted to do things like reroute Route 28. He had buildings moved 90 degrees at his whim. He also thought that there ought to be the best of the best for the students of Phillips Academy. He was not necessarily known as an art collector prior to his decision around 1928, which I'll speak to in greater detail, to assemble what his perceived as the nucleus of the Addison's core collection. There's actually a show that I organized up right now of a good portion of the 58 works of art that were donated to Phillips Academy in 1928 in honor of its 150th anniversary. And this predates the conception of the Addison Gallery. Even though he was not a major art collector in his own right, he, as a principal at J.P. Morgan's firm, traveled in a certain upper class, high society milieu that included people like Charles Platt, the architect and eventual member of the Addison's art committee, Zadie Cobb Bliss, his dear friend after whose mother the Addison is named, Stephen Clark, and perhaps most importantly, Lizzie Plummer Bliss, who I'll speak about later. His idea was that why shouldn't the men of Andover be surrounded by the best of the best? And as he went about his major transformative philanthropic efforts in the late 1920s into the 1930s, his blank checkbook facilitated the construction of numerous academic buildings, residential buildings, the bird sanctuary, the chapel, and for us, most importantly, the Addison Gallery of American Art. He began with a very strong work of art, Winslow Homer's masterpiece, The West Wind, currently on view. He was also something of a maverick. He went to the owner of the painting in the late 1920s, Samuel Untermeyer, to his Yonkers estate, Greystone, and made him an offer that he truly could not refuse, a sum of some $40,000, adjusted for inflation to around $800,000 in today's currency, to purchase this Winslow Homer masterwork. And this acquisition for such an astronomical sum set a standard of quality and artistic excellence that Cochrane and his associates hoped to continue on as they made subsequent purchases for first Phillips Academy and eventually the Addison Gallery of American Art, a department of Phillips Academy. He relied on the advice of his what he designated as a core art committee. And he relied, though most significantly, on the guidance of William McIntyre of the Macbeth Gallery. And there are lots of ethical questions and quandaries that we can explore of having a dealer be the kind of moving, generating force behind the formation of a collection. He made out quite well. He earned commissions on every sale and was able to really enshrine Macbeth's stable in what was then one of the first museums of American art. Macbeth Gallery was established in 1892 by the Scotch-Irish immigrant William Macbeth. By that time, the market for American paintings had really flatlined, as well-heeled New York collectors preferred to acquire European works as incredible symbols of their status. And an announcement proclaiming the opening of his gallery, one devoted solely to the work of American artists, which was quite radical for the time, Macbeth stated that, quote, "The work of American artists has never received the full share of appreciation that it deserves, and the time has come when an effort should be made to gain for it the favor of those who have hitherto purchased foreign pictures exclusively. As I shall exhibit only that which is thoroughly good and interesting, I hope to make this establishment known as the place where may be procured the very best our artists can produce," end quote. Robert McIntyre was the nephew of Macbeth founder William Macbeth's son, Robert Macbeth. And you can actually see him in his younger years on the right-hand side showing this elderly gentleman a painting. This is an engraving by John Sloan. John Sloan, of course, participated in Macbeth Gallery's most radical exhibition, the 1908 exhibition of the Eight, which was an exhibition that protested the restrictive policies of the National Academy of Design and thrust the artists associated with the Ashcan School into the national spotlight. But by the 1930s, Macbeth Gallery and Robert McIntyre, who had then risen through the ranks to be one of the leaders of the gallery, by the time of the Addison's foundry, the Macbeth Gallery was still holding on to the figurative tradition and had a stable of rather conservative painters. Most importantly, they were vehemently opposed to the perceived corrupting influence of modernism. Back to royal court, though, unfortunately. McIntyre sought the approval and solicited the feedback of Royal Cortizo. Royal Cortizo, who Andrew mentioned earlier, this is a kind of an interesting historic note. He was born to an English father of Spanish descent and a mother from Martinique. He became one of that will come in to be quite ironic later on. He became one of the most powerful art critics of his time and was the chief art critic for the New York Herald Tribune from 1891 until his death in 1948. So he saw quite a lot. In his perhaps most influential or inflammatory, infamous essay, Ellis Island Art from 1923, he articulates a point of view that I think was quite instrumental in the founding of the Addison Gallery's core collection. He notes, the United States is invaded by aliens, thousands of whom constitute so many acute perils to the health of the body politic. Modernism is of precisely the same heterogeneous alien origin and is imperiling the republic of art in the same way. Such movements, crude, crotchety, tasteless, abounding in arrogant assertion, making a fetish of ugliness, and above all else, rife in ignorance of the technical amenities. The movements have been promoted by types not yet fitted for their first papers in aesthetic naturalization, the makers of true Ellis Island art. It makes sense that Hilton Kramer would later refer to him as a patrician dodo. Hilton Kramer would go on in his 1987 article called The Idea of Tradition in American Art Criticism to note that until we encounter this chilling note of xenophobia in his writing, Royal Cortizo may strike us, if not exactly an innocent, then as some sort of benighted but essentially harmless gentleman amateur, a last gasp perhaps of the genteel tradition that dominated our culture before modernism arrived to cut off its supply of oxygen. And it is certainly true that Cortizo's notion of tradition was one that very much conformed to the tenets of genteel tradition, with its yearning for a world free of the kind of unruly emotions, exacerbated social conflicts, disruptive artistic innovations, and alien influences that we associate with the modern age. The Addison Gallery of American Art emerged from this socio-political climate of the United States in the 1920s, one characterized by the pervasive resurgence of nativist, anti-immigrant rhetoric and the increasingly restricted definition of American. Reeling from the devastation and destabilization wrought by World War I and ensuing economic collapse, the American political and cultural establishment became fearful of the perceived corrupting influence of the quote-unquote other in all facets of American life, including the realms of art and culture. Also during this time, between 1890 and 1930, America's population doubled. And by the time of the 1929 crash, it is noted that 1 in 10 Americans were either foreign born or had a parent who was an immigrant. So you can imagine that the patrician, Brahmin, upper crust that founded the Addison were quite cognizant of this shifting demographic. Kind of most curiously and interestingly enough, McIntyre submitted a list to Royal Cortizo for his feedback. Our first curator, Charles Sawyer, made it very clear that this list was made by a committee consisting of Mr. Thomas Cochran, the art committee. It never had any official standing in the formation of the collection. So very clear to distance himself from Royal Cortizo, but it's sort of a fun quirk of our founding that this document was sent of sort of a wish list of deceased and living artists for Royal Cortizo's feedback. On artists like Ralph Albert Blakelock, Cortizo notes, I am dubious about him. His style is stenciled and artificial. The particular note of the American landscape school is its fresh, unspoiled character. All the natural juices are squeezed out of Blakelock. He may last, but I doubt it. I would advise the purchase of a picture by him only after you had got everybody else and found you had some money to spare. On Maurice Prendergast, yes, if a good example is available, but no hurry about him. Interesting, but not very important. And on Walt Kuhn, I can't for the life of me see why. Dreadful stuff. He did, to his credit, encourage the acquisition of work by Mary Cassatt, William Merritt Chase, Marioki Dewing, Albert Pinkham Ryder, in addition to many artists whose names have largely been forgotten to time, including W. Gedney Bunce, George Fuller, Charles Webster Hawthorne, Eugene Higgins, and Van Deering Perrine. And my apologies to all the Van Deering Perrine scholars out there. You can see how thoroughly absorbed in this rhetoric, this anti-immigrant rhetoric, and really proto-fascist rhetoric, McIntyre, the primary mouthpiece of the Addison's Gallery's formation. I should note that we don't have definitive proof that Cochran, who drafted the terms of trust that I'll get to in just a moment, espouse these feelings, but it's very clear to me that by appointing McIntyre and by approving the publication of this article in the Phillips Bulletin in 1928, that Cochrane certainly would co-sign these statements. This is a fascinating article, and I'll read an excerpt. And it's one that, it answers a question that I've often had, and I had when I was planning this exhibition, is why did the Addison go to this very restrictive definition of what is American art? So he notes, then another problem arose and further consultation ensued as to the nature of this collection. Should it be composed of a heterogeneous group of pictures by both foreign and American artists, or confined to the works of our own painters? Patriotism and a just pride answer this question. For is not Phillips Academy an American institution, the oldest preparatory school in the country, founded upon American ideals, implanting them, furthering and promoting them through the education of its youth? It was therefore agreed that its collection of pictures, insofar as those responsible for its development were concerned, should represent all that is best in American painting, not only of past generations, but of the present one as well, and should aim to inculcate in the hearts of the students a reverent respect for the noble heritage handed down to us from our early progenitors in art, to inspire them with the creative ability of our artists and their high ideals. In short, to bring them to a realization of the integrity and independence of our native school of painting, and to enlighten them with its early beginnings, its one-time submergence under European influences, its slow recovery from these, its later development, and its present full-fledged and glorious freedom. What a prospect for aesthetic culture. What an outlook for the future appreciation of American art. And if you excuse the sort of proto-Mussolini tones of his rhetoric, you can also sort of pick apart some of the ironies and the inconsistencies in this policy. He goes on to note that it is to be expected, however, that now and again little errors of judgment will show themselves, and to provide for such contingency, occasional reviews will be made when at such times the collection will be subject to certain changes, should these provide necessary for the good of the whole. In other words, careful watch will be kept so that no elements foreign to the high ideals will be allowed to creep in. If they do unwittingly creep in, they will be quickly eliminated. And one of the great ironies of the founding collection is that while they were so clear about their desire to celebrate this integrity and independence of our native school, in quotation marks, they sought works by American artists who were essentially American by technicality, filling our storerooms with work by James McNeill Whistler, a Lowell resident, if anyone, no, that doesn't get anything? Okay. A local boy who left the United States shortly after his disastrous time at West Point, and spent the bulk of his career in Europe. John Singer Sargent was not born in the United States. He was born in Florence, Italy, to expat parents, and continued to work and spend the bulk of his career abroad. Successive purchases included work by Benjamin West, who left before the United States was the United States. So again, you get at this sort of precarity of our definition of American art. But I would argue that it's really all tied to this notion of constructing a usable past. They were creating an American art historical canon in real time where one did not exactly exist. There's this great excerpt. The term usable past was coined by the literary critic Van Wyck Brooks in a 1918 article. And he says, we have had our historians too, and they've held over the dark backwards of time the divining rods of their imagination and conjured out of it what they wanted and what their contemporaries wanted. And you can see that being done with the founding collection of the Addison Gallery. McIntyre, Cochrane, and the cabal of interested patrons reaching back into the dark backward time with their divining rods to pick artists that would serve to bolster the perception of American art, desperately seeking all the time the approbation of Europe, and dealing with a major inferiority complex. The amorphous collection of American paintings assembled by Cochrane and his associates for Phillips Academy's 150th anniversary was first installed in the trustees' boardroom at George Washington Hall. You can see the west wind hanging over the scale model of the completely redesigned Phillips Academy campus to the left. You see Arthur B. Davies' works, Thayer's works, Sargent represented on the far right. The fact that this collection of 58 works had already outgrown its home in the trustees' room led Thomas Cochrane to seek to find a permanent solution and ensure the ongoing care and growth of the collection that he had begun to construct. His 1930s terms of trust offered greater coherence and structure to Phillips Academy's nascent American art collection, providing for the construction of a permanent museum building and the continual growth of the collection itself. Quote, bent on a desire to enrich permanently the lives of the students of Phillips Academy by helping to cultivate and foster in them a love for the beautiful, I shall be glad to establish at the Academy, if entirely acceptable to the Board of Trustees, an endowed gallery of American art. And toward the project, he subscribed now the sum of $1,480,000, oh my, you think I could read a number? $1,480,781.22, at the same time expressing the hope that I can make further contributions to this project as time goes on. One of the most important stipulations in his terms of trust, however, is the fourth codicil, which reads, the Addison Gallery shall only house painting, sculpture, silver, and other works of art or craftsmanship produced by a native-born or naturalized citizen of the United States. To this condition, there may be the following exceptions, namely temporary loan exhibits. So it should be noted that the Addison has never had a restriction placed on the artists that we can show. This deals with the accession of works of art. And photographs and books produced or by authors other than native-born or naturalized citizens of the United States. Likewise, there may be housed in the Addison Gallery scale models of famous ships, also items of English silver produced by other than native-born or naturalized citizens, but otherwise approved by the Addison Gallery Committee and the Board of Trustees. He later made several other curious loopholes, including portraits of busts of Americans and portrayals of American scenes or vessels by artists of foreign birth produced no later than 1800, and pieces of pottery or glassware of whatever origin or date decorated with American scenes. This noble heritage that he speaks of is, of course, as we've learned so far from our two previous presenters, a noble heritage that was shared by the founders of our institution, Thomas Cochrane and his collaborators, being all of the patrician set of Anglo-Saxon white upper-class Americans. Never endeavoring to present a truly exhaustive narrative of American artistic production, Cochrane and his advisors nevertheless sought to add a greater balance and nuance to the Addison's core collection, filling in chronological gaps and adding significant works by artists not represented in the 1928 collection. And this is in a very brief period between 1928 and 1931. The Addison's collection grew from 58 works to nearly 500, which is a speed of collecting that not even Crystal Bridges could match. Not to get controversial. At a time, wrote inaugural Addison curator Charles Sawyer, son of James C. Sawyer, Cochrane's classmate, friend and the treasurer of Phillips Academy. This is a time when nepotism did actually work. When good American paintings were becoming scarce and prices steadily rising, Mr. Cochrane and his associates had the courage to pay whatever sums were necessary to acquire the best works available by each of the artists they chose to represent. And in the course of 3 years, over $1 million was spent, and a collection which would rank with the best in its field was assured. This is a view of the installation that you would have encountered when you came in the 1930s. You can see the sort of greatest hits on view. But I'll note that the Addison has never been a stagnant or staid institution. One of the key members of the founding art committee was Lizzie Bliss. And here she is, and alongside a photograph of her music room. And I should note, if you've ever sat down on our couches, you're sitting on Lizzie Bliss's original Art Deco couches. They're no longer slip-covered. They probably should be. But you can see there, of course, a massive Cézanne now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art hanging over her fireplace. She was one of the most adventuresome and daring collectors of her day, of course, one of the most respected, and a woman in a field dominated by men. She unfortunately died several months before the Addison opened, but her spirit lived on in the Addison's development. And I think that there's a great quote that I think I'll pretty much end with, where she, in a catalog that was published by the Museum of Modern Art, actually 3 years after the Addison showed her collection of European modernism in 1931, which drew the ire of the townsfolk of Andover. Some called it sloppy, grotesque, but it brought people in through the door, I can tell you that. She wrote in a letter to a national academician, Quote, "The truth is you older men seem intolerant and supercilious, a state of mind incomprehensible to a philosopher who looks on and enjoys watching for and finding the new men in music, painting, and literature who have something to say worth saying and claim for themselves only the freedom to express it in their own way, a claim which you have always maintained as your inalienable right." Oh, I should mention, we did get a Walt Kuhn, even though Royal Cortiso didn't agree with it, and incredible work by Charles Prendergast. So anything in that initial gallery that you see today that has any kind of whiff of a modern tradition, that's coming from Lizzie Bliss. And I'll end with this humorous cartoon from William Hamilton, a cartoonist for The New Yorker, who was kind of the poet laureate of American WASPs, class of 1958, where you have a woman looking at a man saying, "Sometimes I think you might have been sensitive, even if you hadn't been molded by that art gallery back at Andover," which I think speaks to some of the tensions inherent in our founding and in our present. We are located on the campus of arguably the most privileged secondary school in the United States. We live in the wake of a very restrictive collections policy. But I would say, like Lizzie Bliss, the spirit of this institution has always been daring and brave. Even though the structure, you walk up, you think you're entering this temple, this unchanging temple to American art. But if you come 1 month to the next, you'll notice changes. We've avoided the fixity of a permanent collection installation since the very beginning. Sawyer was smart enough to know that he could not bring Andover's young men into the gallery if the same paintings were on view every single time they came. And that sort of dynamism has charted the course, or has been the lodestar that the Addison has followed since its origin. We are perpetually in flux, in a state of permanent impermanence, where the definition, while very restrictive, of American being defined by citizen only, is not one that is practiced in our exhibition programming, allowing for very complicated, nuanced dialogues, and allowing us to respond to our time. We're not planning permanent collections, installations that are meant to last 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, not even 1 year. Our permanent collection is treated like a temporary exhibition, and we constantly are reevaluating and rethinking what it means to be American, and how we both perpetuate and shift the origin of our institution. And I'll end with a motto of Phillips Academy, Finis Origine Pendent, the end depends on the beginning. We are beginning at a state of restriction, of marginalization, but I would say that over the last 90 years, the Addison has proven itself to be at the forefront of the continued redefinition of what it means to be American. Thank you. And sorry, I talked way too long. Just want to make sure your microphone. There we go.
Thank you, all of you, for setting up the major themes of this symposium. And so I have a couple of things I'm interested in, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, who I'm sure have many questions for all of you. So this symposium takes as its premise then and now. And this is something that really all of you touched on in various ways in your talks, but I'm interested in hearing a bit more about how you see the sort of echoes or reverberations of this historical context that you set out, continuing into the present. How have those conditions continued to shape our world today?
Good question.
I'll say one thing about the predicament of high art museums, which is that they're dependent on extremely expensive objects that are hard to come by. And to the extent that stories are determined by the objects in the collection, and then the collection is dependent on sources of money that museums often don't have, and therefore on donors that are willing to give to them, there's a way in which storytelling is going to be inhibited by the collections and where those collections come from. So that's an unfortunate, university curricula can change very quickly, museums' collections cannot. So I think that's one way in which the past continues to influence the present.
Thanks for your question. I think there's a number of ways we can think about your question, but I think the one that seems to be most pressing to me is that adding to a collection is additive unless you make it transformative. So you can have stipulations around citizenship. You can expand the demographics of what those U.S. citizens look like, which happened in the U.S. over the course of the 20th century. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your canon of work and your understanding of it has changed. And I think one of the issues that we're still dealing with as Americans, as non-Americans, as maybe Americans, as suspect Americans, is really rethinking that canon. And you see these debates unfolds in many ways. We recently had the novelist Celeste Ng on campus. She wrote Little Fireflies Everywhere. I think everyone who's like 20 and under knows who she is. And one of the things that she said, which I think is so true and applies to not just the world of writing, but also applies to the world of art, is that folks who aren't a fundamental part of that original Anglo-Saxon canon feel like there's only space for one of them, right? There's space for one Japanese American artist. There's space for one South Asian American artist. There's space for one Puerto Rican artist, right? And so those identities aren't really fundamentally shifting the way in which we are understanding what is American art. They're still seen as additive. And I think that the fundamental question is, how can we reinscribe what the canon is and come to terms with the very difficult questions of what formed that canon to begin with?
Yeah, I would just say, and I really don't have anything better to add because I think it's just been covered really beautifully. But I do think that I think a freedom to expand definitions without changing the underlying structure is a sort of a failed experiment, and that institutions do need to be responsive to their communities, do need to be responsive to their patrons. So it's a very fraught, of course, issue, but one that I think we're, as a field, navigating in real time. So it's an exciting, if not daunting, time to be in a museum, particularly of American art.
So I think we have some mics circulating if people have questions. And while people are thinking of their question, one more. I know that both Hardeep and Andrew, this research that you presented is part of larger book projects. So if you could speak a bit about what motivated this overall project.
Well, my own interest right now in the book I'm doing about the simultaneous creation of the Gardner Museum and the second MFA, the new one, arose out of COVID in a sense. I had a year off and all of a sudden COVID hit and I thought, oh, I better stay local. Who knows when I'll be able to go anywhere else in the world or look at anything else in the world. So it's something I've been long wanting to do and the time just seemed right. So I'm enjoying that delve into local things.
I wish I could say that my project was local, but it's really not. It's like transnational, transimperial, as I call it. So my book project looks at the legal construction of the mixed status family in the United States, which is the history of immigrants who come to the U.S. have no pathway to naturalization, either because they're prohibited or they're undocumented, and what family structures look like once you have a child who's birthright. So I look at that over the course of a 100-year time span, also very lengthy, but I'm moved by questions in our everyday, by American policy in the present, which seeks to restrict rights on the basis of legal status. There was a time in this country where if you lived somewhere for a certain amount of years, regardless of what your legal status was, you could vote as an immigrant. That seems to be outside of our political conversation today. So I'm going back to these historical questions to think about the way the past was, but also ways in which we can rethink our present, but also the ways in which that history remains very present to our current political landscape. And it remains very present to my life as an educator. I have a handful of students who are in mixed status families with siblings who are undocumented or parents who are undocumented. And so I feel like my book it's great. It's intellectually rigorous. I meet the criteria of a good Ivy League scholar, but it's politically and ethically relevant for me.
Now, I'd love to hear from the audience. Are there any questions you have for our panelists?
Thank you. My question is about how do we decolonize the landscape of galleries, specifically like the layout or architecture, because I think Gordon sort of alluded to like the Georgian heritage of the Addison, and how do we shift that layout or landscape there?
That's a good question. So I think, well, Andrew's point was so well taken that there is this sort of architectural enforcement of hierarchies. I think, speaking personally to the Addison, we're a far more intimate institution. If you've been, you can sort of see all of it within a pretty compact period of time. So we don't contend with the same issues around architecture, around space being kind of inhospitable to reinterpretations of our collection. We sort of see the Addison as a bit of a black box. We certainly have a very a beautifully proportioned, very symmetrical, very classical environment, but it lends itself to really all of our projects, which is quite remarkable. It seems to be, we have a colleague who always says that the Addison is the Platonic ideal of a museum. And so we're very biased and very lucky to be able to work in an institution that is so flexible. But I know that is not the case for all, and certainly not the case in encyclopedic museums where that could require major funding and major architectural projects.
One possible, architecture is hard to change. I mean, it's you don't replace a building easily. Bit easier to change the internal reworking of a collection, but still difficult. But I'm mindful of an example like the Brooklyn Museum, for example, which added an architectural forecourt in front of the museum, and I don't pretend to be, I'm certainly not a local, but it does seem to have changed the affect of the place. I mean, you put something modern and courtyard-like in front of an old classical facade, and maybe you can change the way in which people think about it. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what Stephanie would say about that experience in Brooklyn. But maybe that's one way of doing things, expensive though that is.
I'd like to ask Gordon about the collecting of photography and how that fit. When did that start, and how does that fit in? Because that's a very unusual part of the history and even the present day of the Addison.
Great question, Dennis. Thank you. I didn't plant that in the audience, but the Addison first began collecting photography in 1934. So we opened our doors in 1931. And very soon thereafter started to invite photographers to show their work at the Addison. So one of the first shows was a solo show for Margaret Bork White, and we acquired prints from that show for $5 a piece. And I think that really put us on a path. There were many reasons for that, back to finances. Photographs then and still are at a far more accessible price point than paintings typically in a typical sense. And there was never at the Addison this hierarchy across media in the same entrenched ways that you see it in institutions where photography departments didn't emerge until the 1970s. The only space left was the basement space. So if you go to the Art Institute, you go to the basement to see photographs. And there was never that sort of hierarchy at place at the Addison. And I think the other factor that I would say that has really contributed to our major acquisition and then exhibition and history of really pioneering photographic exhibitions is the fact that we mix media in our installations. Our permanent collection shows it would be very rare for you to come and see a show purely of paintings at the Addison, and that's been the way for many years. So when we hear from friends of the Addison who have just been to MoMA and seen their reinstall that integrates photos and paintings and sculpture together, it's sort of like, have you not been to the Addison in the last 90 years? It's because everything is temporary. We don't run into the same issues around light exposure as other institutions do, where you really have to factor in rotations. Those take that takes a lot of time, a lot of planning in advance. So we have the flexibility and the nimble kind of quality to integrate photographs into a conversation where they're often not integrated or separated, and also by virtue of the fact we don't have a siloed curatorial department. We work across media and across time periods here. So we're set up in a fairly unique way to collect and exhibit photographs, but it's over half of our collection. So our collection is around 26,000 objects, so over half are photographs, and that's been a collecting priority really almost since the very beginning.
I hope this question is appropriate. In view of what I perceive as the polarization of the country, and restrictions that are being imposed upon what can be taught at schools, and the cutting back of the support of the global arts by state legislatures, what influence is that going to have on museums in the future, and perhaps the role of American art in the future?
That's an intense question. Great question, but.
It's an intense question, but I think it's not just in relationship to art, but in relationship to developing an articulate critical vocabulary and education that's happening quite vigorously across the nation. So I'm just going to call out the things that are in the shadow of your question. Things like critical race theory are up for grabs. History courses are up for grabs. I mean, history is like the most politicized discipline in this country. And you would, and for me, it's that defunding and the kind of threat to these fields it's a fundamental threat about having a critical vocabulary about the past and the present and being able to articulate difficult pasts, right? So if you take the inability to talk about slavery off the table, or if you take if you take histories of indigenous communities or U.S. imperialism off the table, what does that mean in terms of how everyday people are able, including students, right, from secondary level to from primary level to secondary level, able to articulate both their own experiences in relationship to race, gender, sexuality, and I do want to emphasize it's not just race, it's also gender and sexuality that's up for grabs, quite literally these days. And so if you take that off the table, you're really preventing really generations of people from understanding and articulating things about their experiences and the real worlds in which we live. And I think that has, if I were to bring it back to art, has a direct relationship to what, again, we think about what constitutes the canon, how can you deconstruct that, decolonize that, and then also how do you interpret it, right? You need to have a critical vocabulary and understanding of history and the politics around you to be able to decolonize anything. And once that is stripped, there's real questions of, your limitations on how you understand the world. I should say I think about this question a lot because my presentation is critical race theory in the shadows. I would not be able to show that in certain states, in certain jurisdictions. And I remind my students of that every time I teach this material, that we are only able to learn it at Penn because we have not removed it from the curriculum.
So this is more of a question to Professor McClellan. And when you mentioned your book, which, is that a book that is out yet or is in progress? She's laughing.
No,
That was a good question. But I couldn't help, well, okay. Can I just say one thing and then let you talk? So what was so exciting to me to hear you talk about is the fact that you were writing on the Gardner Museum, which has had ad infinitum, fame and infamy and bad and good written about it. It's an extraordinary place. I've been, teaching and going there for 55 years. But to do that also in juxtaposition to the new look and the new ideas of the MFA. So my thought here was that there's a woman, Isabella Stewart Gardner, who put into her will that nothing could be changed, who started out, collecting only the great European canon with a wall of money. But after her husband died, et cetera, she started going, really collecting things that were of interest all over the world. And small art, high art, low art, if you want to call it. I don't call anything low art, but what I'm talking, tapestries, ceramics, everything. I would so much want to know, because now that place is transformative. With the new wing, you can't help if you go there. The natural thing is to go from what's very contemporary and new and international, global, everything, to back to the main part of the museum and make connections. So I find this extraordinary, and I'd love to know about your book and when it's coming out.
We can chat at the reception, but it's not on the horizon quite yet. But I mean, we could talk a lot about Mrs. Gardner, but we can do that offline. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, yes, to piggyback on that first comment about the architecture of the museum and how does the audience get it and how does it affect the greater audience, I want to remind folks that at the beginning of the mission of Thomas Cochrane, and with his deep pockets, it went from his pockets to Mr. McIntyre's pockets, which is okay. But the mission of education, and then also he mentions the idea of the community. But I think the idea of the community has changed from when Mr. Cochrane was around, that he thought the community meaning the Andover community. Well, thank goodness for curators like Christopher Cook and Jock Reynolds and O'Alley that have expanded that community, in particular to Lawrence to the north over here, which was the epicenter of the type of population that they did not want to participate or welcome into the museum. So the idea of the architecture of the museum, the Addison has really made it a point, and my kids have benefited, of opening it to the wider community and recognizing those people around the other areas outside of the campus of Phillips Academy. So I think we need to give them credit for that, because I think they've evolved the institutions. Some institutions have modeled their programming after the Addison's outreach educational program. So I just wanted that to be out there and let people know that we've enjoyed it.
That's very kind, but I would also say that we're very aware of how far there is to go. And I think that our architecture, back to architecture, is not the most welcoming. We're set back from the street, as you probably dealt with earlier today. There's terrible parking. It's hard enough to park here and work here. It must be very hard to visit and park. But also you have to ascend this steep staircase. There are pillars. We have banners that are sort of one of the concessions that were made by the school to allow us to sort of more publicly embrace our community. But I do think that there's more to do. So I do, the comment is very well received. But I don't want this to seem like we're, congratulating ourselves, because there is still so much more that we can do to sort of become more connected to our local community. And our education team is really at the forefront and does amazing things with a team of 3 accomplishing Herculean tasks. So I think there's only more to go and more for us to do. But I think we have an amazing legacy to build on, and people like Jock and Adam and Chris Cook are really responsible for that, and Allie, of course.
Well, now I invite you all to join us outside where there's refreshments, and then also next door where you can speak to our student exhibitors. And the museum is also open. You can go around that way if you want to see the exhibitions that Gordon mentioned, and we'll see you back here at 3.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us now for our second panel, and I hope that you enjoyed the intermission. And I want to thank our collaborators from our faculty at Phillips Academy and students as well for enhancing our presentation of our symposium so greatly by their presence. So thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Rachel Vogel. Rachel is the assistant curator at the Addison Gallery of American Art, where she focuses on modern and contemporary art. Before joining the Addison, Rachel contributed to numerous exhibitions and publications at the Johnson Kulakundis Gallery at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, as well as curated exhibitions at Art League Houston and Rice University's Media Art Center Gallery, among others. Her writing has been published in American Art On Stands Now, a new article, very exciting, Art Journal, CAA Reviews, Oxford Art Journal, and Print Quarterly, and in several exhibition catalogs. She received her PhD in art history from Harvard University, and she has taught courses at Georgetown University, Harvard University, Vassar College, and the Wonderworks pre-college program at Rice University. Please welcome Rachel Vogel to the podium.
Thanks, Gordon. All right, so as we were critically thinking about the Addison's definition of American art and how this impacted our institution's legacy, I was curious as to how other museums of American art understood the term. So I first identified 18 museums dedicated to American art, like the Addison, and asked them how they defined American when considering objects or when considering artists or objects for acquisition or exhibition. I also asked them if this definition was detailed in any governing documents, as is the case at the Addison, and if there had been any previous internal conversations about how their museum defines American art. I'm very thankful to all of the museum curators and staff who responded to the survey. For this first part, including the Addison, 11 American art museums responded, and I received additional information from the Whitney's 2017 collection management policy. Of those surveyed, only 4 museums officially clarified the scope of American art in their governance documents or were working on such definitions. So in contrast to the Addison's terms of trust, which, as Gordon previously described, defines American artists as those with legal citizenship status, the Whitney specifies in its 1958 Statement of History, Purpose, and Activities that foreign birth and citizenship are not considered, only whether an artist's career has been identified with this country. An artist may either be an American citizen or may have produced a significant body of work while living in the United States. This definition is similar to the one used by Crystal Bridges, who in their 2023 collection plan defines the collection parameters as work by artists who live and work in the United States, as well as artists from other parts of the world if they have strong connections and significant impact in the United States. And prior to this collection plan, which was initiated on the 10th anniversary of Crystal Bridges, they didn't have an official definition clarifying the scope of their collection or the meaning of American art. The Ogunquit Museum of American Art is in the process of revisiting and clarifying their acquisition and exhibition parameters, and while these conversations are ongoing, the current draft of these policies uses the following language. American art should not be conceived as including only those artists born in the United States and its overseas territories as citizens. Rather, in following a long tradition in the museum's conception of American art, American encompasses artists working throughout the North American continent, including artists who immigrate to, are permanent residents of, or residing in Canada, Mexico, and the United States and its overseas territories, as well as those artists who may not reside in, but respond to ideas of Americanness. Of note here is the fact that unlike the Whitney and Crystal Bridges definitions, which understands American art to be related to the United States, and true of the Addison as well, OMAA extends its definition to the North American continent. This dates back to 1957, the institution's earliest documented efforts defining American art, which also said that it encompassed the North American continent. So within just these 4 official definitions, we already have 3 distinct interpretations of American art. One that limits it to art produced by American citizens. 2 museums understand it to mean work by artists with significant ties to the United States. And 1 museum extends that to encompass the entire North American continent. The Whitney and Crystal Bridges definition of American art, which I refer to as the strong connection definition, was by far the most common among the surveyed museums, even if this wasn't something that was explicitly laid out in a collection policy. At the Hunter Museum, artists don't have to be born in the United States, but need to have a strong connection to the US, for example, by studying there, living there, having a studio there, etc. Similarly, at the Brandywine Museum of Art, they generally show and collect work by those born in the US or those who are primarily known for their work in the US. And it's also worth noting that Brandywine made the choice to use art of the United States rather than American art in a recent job posting to clarify the scope of their mission. Along the same lines, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, their curatorial team clarified, non-US citizens who have lived here and exerted great impact on American art and culture have been and continue to be candidates for inclusion in SAM's exhibition program and collection. So all of these definitions are kind of on similar terms of defining Americanness based on their contributions to the country rather than citizenship status. The Westmoreland Museum of Art's American Art's 2011 collection management policy defines their collection scope as objects that are of American origin with specialization related to the arts and artists of southwestern Pennsylvania. As curator Jeremiah McCarthy further summarized, the institution's policy is collecting exceptional works of art made within the United States, its territories, and native lands. This is unique in seemingly focusing more on the place that the artwork is made rather than the national affiliation of the artist. But there have been recent discussions within their collection committee about acquiring works by foreign-born artists who made important work after moving to the United States. And this has prompted the committee to decide that the museum needs a clear definition. The Amon Carter Museum of American Art's collection and exhibition policy is best characterized as including artists from the United States, with frequent exhibition for people who worked or lived in the United States, but they have more recently acquired works by Mexican artists, and in their indigenous collecting efforts have sometimes purchased objects from First Nation artists in what is now Canada. Until 2013, when the museum was founder-led, the definition was even stricter, and it was restricted to both works made by United States artists that depicted the United States. But even during this period, there were exceptions, including a large collection of posada prints and other works by 19th century Mexican artists. Only a few American art museums have adopted a hemispheric definition of the Americas that encompasses North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. While the Midwest Museum of American Art doesn't have an official written policy or definition of American art, their interpretation has expanded over the years. It's still the case that most of the objects in their collection are created by artists living and working in the United States, but the Director-Curator Brian Byrne has encouraged trustees and museum colleagues to consider adding works by Caribbean, North, South, and Central American artists, and he will encourage trustees and staff to formally adopt a written policy defining the museum scope upon his upcoming retirement, and perhaps prompted by the questions in the survey. Similarly, staff at the Hunter Museum have discussed broadening their conception of American art to include all of North, South, and Central America, and they also continue to grapple with what American means in the context of contemporary art that is increasingly international and interconnected. Another topic that repeatedly surfaced among survey responses was the inclusion of Indigenous art within American art collections. Crystal Bridges' recent collection plan acknowledges their collection includes work by Indigenous artists who belong to sovereign nations that existed prior to and or coexisted with the United States. Similarly, the Hunter has also had institutional conversations around definitions of American art when discussing Indigenous artworks that predate the establishment of the United States as a country. SAM's current reinstallation project prioritizes, among other objectives, the need to present Indigenous artistic practices, both ancestral and contemporary, which previously existed mostly outside the museum's collection and exhibition program. Overall, from these responses, it's clear that the Addison is an outlier in its limitation of American artists to those with citizenship, with the Whitney, OMAA, and SAM even explicitly stating that citizenship is not relevant to determining if an artist falls within their collecting scope. On this topic, I'll also note an interesting observation about the Lunder Institute of American Art, which unfortunately didn't respond to the survey, but earlier this year, their website stated that their mission was to preserve and collect works of art in all media created by citizens of our country. However, following a recent website redesign in February, the language of their mission statement no longer includes any specific mention of citizenship. As is the case with the Butler, many respondents noted that their institution's definitions of American art have evolved over the years, and many have recently completed or are in the midst of institutional conversations that critically reconsider what American art means today. Both Crystal Bridges and the Whitney recently produced new collection strategic plans, and SAM is currently in the middle of a major reinstallation project. The Cahoon Museum of American Art has never overtly defined the term, but as they too are entering into an expansion project, they also are developing a collection plan that will include a definition of American art. So the second part of the survey involved American art departments within broader or encyclopedic museums. I asked them what constitutes American art for the purposes of your institution's departmental divisions, and if this scope had undergone any significant changes or redefinitions. 14 museums spanning the country responded. And the biggest takeaway from this data set was the issue of managing overlapping collection areas. So if for museums in the first part of the survey, the definition of American art really determined if they could or could not exhibit or acquire works of art, in these museums, it's more of a question of where do we put it? Across museums, divisions between departments were often described as idiosyncratic. As just one example, at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, there are 7 separate departments that deal with American art, while the collection of the American art department itself is constrained by media, geography, and time period. In the recently redesigned permanent American art galleries, however, these paintings and sculptures are joined by photography, books, prints, furniture, ceramics, metals, textiles, and costumes that are drawn from multiple museum collections. Over half of the surveyed institutions mentioned defining their American art collections with chronological parameters. Most departments' collections spanned from around the 17th or 18th century to the mid-20th century, with American artworks produced after that point typically falling under the purview of the modern contemporary department. Erin Monroe at the Wadsworth Athenaeum noted how these chronological divisions have been an ongoing point of conversation at her institution. The Wadsworth defines American art as art made in the United States from the colonial period to World War II, so any artwork made in 1946 or beyond is in the contemporary department. However, one increasingly obvious consequence of this division was that work from the late 40s and early 1950s was falling through the cracks, and these artworks were those that were often the less well-known and the least researched. While the vast majority of American art museums considered their scope to be the art of the United States, this was only the case in about a third of the surveyed American art departments. And this was actually the same number who took a hemispheric approach of the Americas. Another 3 defined American art as encompassing North America, and 1 department combines American and British paintings. Many of the museums that took a hemispheric approach had somewhat recently made that change. At the Art Institute of Chicago, a 2020 reorganization resulted in the newly named Arts of the Americas department, which spans 5000 BCE to the present and includes art by indigenous, Mesoamerican, Andean, colonial era, and US makers. Similarly, the Harvard Art Museums changed their definition in 2021 to encompass the American Hemisphere, and in November, the Metropolitan Museum of Art will unveil a centennial reinstallation featuring their hemispheric holdings. The Baltimore Museum of Art is also moving in a direction of thinking more hemispherically. This shift to hemispheric departments within encyclopedic museums has encouraged institutions to expand and build collections in areas that have previously been underrepresented or fallen through the cracks, precisely because they didn't fit cleanly into existing curatorial divisions. LACMA also stated that they consider American art to encompass Indigenous South and Central American art, Indigenous North American art, art of the colonial United States, and colonial art of South and Central America. But they were also one of many institutions to highlight that their understanding of the term American art didn't necessarily map onto the ways that curatorial departments were actually organized. And this suggests that institutions' departmental organization is not necessarily reflective of the perspective, beliefs, and methodological positions underlying curatorial strategy. As Virginia Anderson at the Baltimore Museum of Art notes, changes are happening more quickly in gallery displays than department administration. For example, at BMA, the American Arts Department includes work made by colonial and non-Indigenous artists, while Indigenous American art is held in the Arts of Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, or AAPI department. But BMA's recent reinstallation attempts to reflect the simultaneity of native and non-native production more accurately before, collaborating with the curator of Indigenous art in the AAPI department to present Native American objects side by side with non-native works. But these departmental divisions between Indigenous and colonial American art was reflected in several other museums. For example, at the Detroit Institute of Arts, as you see on the left, has both an American department and a separate department that includes Indigenous American art. But again, these organizational divisions are not always reflective of how artworks are exhibited. At the Peabody Essex Museum, works from the Native American Art Collection and American Art Collection are exhibited together in the Putnam Gallery of Native American and American Art. In the words of their curatorial team, this installation places these collections on equal footing. They also clarify that it's important to note that, quote, while PIM puts Native American art in direct dialogue with American art, in this installation and as an institution more broadly, we also dedicate space to presenting Native American art on its own terms, so it's not always in conversation with or in the service of American art. One clear takeaway is that institutions' efforts to rethink definitions and narratives of American art has encouraged more collaboration across different museum departments, allowing more fluidity in the way American art collections are presented. But expanding the definitions and thus purview of American art departments also comes with the responsibility of ensuring that curators can properly steward those collections. More inclusive understandings and presentations of American art must also be supported by the expertise and methodological frameworks necessary to contextualizing the collection. This too points to the importance of collaboration across curatorial divisions and areas of specialization. So I've really only been able to capture the sort of broad strokes of what this survey revealed, and I'm happy to talk more about specifics in Q&A. Building on Andrew's presentation, there's a very interesting history of decorative arts departments and their relationship to American art departments that, again, goes to this idea of the usable past that Gordon brought up. But I do think these overall trends do provide a point of entry into examining the current state of American art. Of course, definitions are only going to be a starting point for thinking about how museums can tell complex and nuanced narratives of American art, but many respondents mentioned how this survey provided the opportunity to reflect on and refine what American art meant for their institution. My hope is that this information not only helps us at the Addison think about our own past and future, but as a field help us be self-reflexive about the very project, mission, and goals of the study and presentation of American art and how institutions can best accomplish that. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Miguel Luciano, who is a multimedia visual artist whose work explores themes of history, popular culture, social justice, and self-determination through painting, sculpture, and socially engaged public art projects. He is the recipient of the Mellon Foundation's Latinx Artist Fellowship, the A Blade of Grass Socially Engaged Art Fellowship, and a Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Award. His work is featured in the permanent collections of the National Gallery of Art, Smithsonian American Art Museum, National Portrait Gallery, National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Brooklyn Museum, El Museo del Barrio, and the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico. Luciano was an inaugural artist in residence in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Civic Practice Partnership Artist Residency Program from 2018 to 2021, and he is currently a faculty member at the School of Visual Arts and Yale University School of Art. Please welcome Miguel to the stage.
Okay. Let me get my timer here. And, okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Rachel for the invitation and the Addison and Lunder Institute for hosting. This has been fascinating, all of the conversations today. And so I'm thrilled to be part of this. I am an artist who's based in New York. I'm from Puerto Rico originally. And I was born on the island, grew up in the States. A lot of my work is about this relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And so I'm showing a few works from the past and present that are speaking to a lot of the same issues, but there are some works that have come into focus recently through recent acquisitions and recent exhibitions. And so I'm, interested also like where Puerto Rico shows up in the sort of landscape of American art and how institutions sort of include us or exclude us. And so I titled this Boricua Rising Signs, thinking about resistance movements and rising in terms of people rising up, past and present, and also thinking about sort of like what it means to have more visibility institutionally. So I'll start here with this painting. This is back in 1998. So it's a painting I did in grad school called "Cómo se dice Boricua en inglés," which in English translates to "How do you say Boricua in English?" And it's a rhetorical question because there's no translation for the word Boricua. Boricua is a term that is a colloquial term for Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico, but it comes from the indigenous word for the island, the Taino word for the island, which was Boriquen. And from Boriquen, we get the word Borinquen and Boricua. And so there is no other translation really for that term. But I'm asking this question in 1998 at the centennial mark of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Puerto Rico. So I'm back and forth to Puerto Rico a lot during this time and throughout my life, really, but especially during this time, thinking very much about this history of exchange between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, the two places that inform who I am, having parents from both places and really growing up in between. And this launches sort of a body of work that for me is very significant, and it has me continuing to look back not just at our past, but at our present and how the conditions of our past continue to inform our present. And so paintings like this were informed by like political cartoons from 100 years prior. I was looking at, what were the earliest images of these exchanges between Puerto Ricans and the United States. And oftentimes they were in political cartoons like this, right? And so there were very demeaning depictions of Puerto Rico and all of the other territories and island nations that were colonized and taken over by the U.S. from Spain. And so these translated into paintings like this, where the kind of villain of Uncle Sam here is being confronted by this unlikely superhero in a flying Vejigante. And the Vejigante is an Afro-Puerto Rican folkloric character that's really an anti-colonial figure that is wielding a machete and threatening to take out the tongue of Uncle Sam, with this parade of colonial characters kind of waiting to speak to this microphone. And so it was really about really questioning the voice that we have or don't have, but also like this relationship fundamentally between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. So again, images like this, I was looking at a lot of images like this, early political cartoons, And advertisements. Some of the very first advertisements in print were also super racist, in terms of depictions of Puerto Ricans. And so there was a whole line of Puerto Rican yams and sweet potatoes in Louisiana in the 1940s. Some of the most explicitly racist labels were labels like this, Coon brand Puerto Rican sweet potatoes. So the same kinds of racial stereotypes that were applied to African Americans in the South and throughout the country were also leveled at Puerto Ricans and other colonial nations during this time period. So these translated for me into paintings that were reinterpreting these histories, like Coño or Coon brand Puerto Rican sweet potatoes becomes Cuño or Coño brand Puerto Rican sweet potatoes. And in Spanish, coño, especially like the elongated version, is an expletive that expresses disgust or rage or anger or surprise. And at this time, this is the year 2000 now, I'm still in grad school. And so the sweet potato turns into the island of Vieques. The island of Vieques is an island off the coast of Puerto Rico that was used as a bombing range by the US Navy for almost 60 years. And there were 60 years of protests against the Navy and against this small little island. Has about 10,000 residents that were forced to live in the center of the island, while the eastern tip was used as a bombing range and the western tip as ammunition storage. And so in 1999, the year before this painting, one of those 500-pound bombs missed its target and killed a civilian named David Sanes. And at that point, the island erupted, and the international community also joined in protest of the Navy's presence. And so in 2003, the Navy finally left. But this was made sort of at the height of these protests in this moment. And at the time, these were the largest public uprisings that we'd ever seen in Puerto Rico. So we're very divided politically, Puerto Rico, in terms of our political status, and I'll get into that. But this was a moment when people sort of crossed political lines to recognize the human rights abuses on the island of Vieques, and it succeeded in forcing the Navy to leave eventually. So throughout these paintings, there are also these kind of mini narratives of colonial resistance that show up throughout all of the work, really. But images like this, the Seal of Louisiana, is placed with this kind of children's books image of, if you can believe this is a children's books image, of the Muerte de Salcedo, Diego Salcedo, or the death of Diego Salcedo. The story is that he was a conquistador who was drowned at the river by a group of Taínos who were dispelling the myth of the Spaniards as gods, right? So is this moment of colonial confrontation, right, that leads to a rebellion, and it's this moment of awakening, but also this moment of confrontation. And so I'm equating that here with the presence of the Navy at the time. Later, these paintings, that was 2000, this is 2017, so this is an extended series. But the most recent from that series is this painting called Vulture Brand, Puerto Rican yams. And here, this is 2017. It is the year that marks the 100-year anniversary of U.S. citizenship for Puerto Ricans. The Jones Act gave us citizenship in 1917. It's also the year that Hurricane Maria hits Puerto Rico. It's also the year after we get Promesa, which was, Puerto Rico's in a serious economic crisis still, but at this point, at one of its highest points, highest moments of crisis economically. And the Promesa Act is passed in 2016 at the end of Obama's administration. And it's supposed to be an economic relief bill, but really becomes an austerity plan for the island that prioritizes paying back the bondholders and the banks that are invested in Puerto Rico's debt. And so this was originally called Victory Brand label. It was painted after World War II, and I turned it into Vulture Brand. That really looks at sort of the predatory nature of these interests in the U.S. today that are backed by the U.S. government. And what happens during the Promesa Act is that an unelected U.S. fiscal board, a U.S.-appointed fiscal board, is given control over the future of the island's economy. And it usurps all local political authority, all local government authority. And so for the first time in a long time, we return to just an old-fashioned version of colonialism where the U.S. has full control. In spite of that, the yams here kind of are resisting, and they turn into these Taíno sort of figures The semi, which are the ancestral spirits that are often carved into stones, and that actually resemble yams. And so there are all these kind of mini narratives, again, throughout the painting, challenging the nature of this relationship today. So from painting to sculpture and installation, my work has continued to sort of confront the problematics of this relationship with the United States. This is a work at the Smithsonian American Art Museum at SAM, and it was my first acquisition by the Smithsonian. I'm very proud that it's there. It's called Double Phantom, and Double Phantom is a work based on two 1952 Schwinn Phantom bicycles. Phantom was the name of the bicycle, that are conjoined at the back, one side representing the US, the other side representing Puerto Rico. And it's a bike that cannot go forwards without going backwards, right, in one direction. And so this is really, more than any other work I've done, really illustrates our political paradox. So this is 2017 also when I make this. So it's the 100-year mark of our citizenship. It's very much questioning the Promesa Act, the nature of our citizenship, and also questioning our political status. So 1952, the year of this bike, was also the year of the Constitution in Puerto Rico. It was also the year that the Popular Democratic Party was formed in Puerto Rico, which is the party that forms to create this Constitution. It's the party that my great-grandfather was part of. He was a representative in the House during that time and signed the Constitution. And so, like, politics run deep in my family. And I learned all about this, like, growing up. Red was the color of that party. So there are lots of things embedded in this. And as beautiful as the bike is, and as beautiful as that idea was at the time, I think, for those who were invested in it, because it imagined a pathway towards self-determination, towards sovereignty at the time. What it really became was a neo-colonial contract that did not change much in Puerto Rico. Congress still has all authority over the island. And so despite, I think, what it was maybe originally intended to become, it became a failure as a project. And the next generation started to really critique that. My other uncles became very pro-independent. We have this movement for statehood on the one hand in Puerto Rico. There's a movement for independence on the other side, and there's this movement to stay in between. This is the bike that stays in between. But in spite of that, the message in neon behind it is "Pa'lante," which means go forward, always forward. And that was the mantra of the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican activist group inspired by the Black Panthers, that was very important in the diaspora, that always insisted on moving forward, right? And I'm saying moving forward with Puerto Rico in mind in this case. So how does this get impact, like in the American Art Museum, the Smithsonian, is a good question. And, for me, the question is in the room. How it gets unpacked is a negotiation with the institution. That's something that I'm super interested in. We have yet to have like a big artist talk there around this issue, but the reorganization of the contemporary galleries, which just reopened recently, is pretty magnificent. And this work is now in conversation with several other works that involve these ideas of American identity and citizenship in ways that are also, I think, challenging and controversial from other artists, Native American artists, African American artists. And so there are many ways that we can, I think, pose these questions that are problematic questions. And so I'm interested in that. I'm interested not in how Puerto Rico is included in American art institutions because we're American. I'm interested in how we're included with works that are obviously critiquing the nature of our relationship, right? That are critiquing colonialism, because Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States. We are the oldest colony in the world. 400 years under Spain, 126 years under the US. It's still a very unresolved problem that we're negotiating. And so in 2019, we had the largest uprisings in our history in Puerto Rico, largest public demonstrations and protests, at a time where people were incredibly frustrated with the management or mismanagement of everything after the hurricane by the federal government here, but also by the local government in Puerto Rico. And the governor at the time, Ricky Rosselló, had become incredibly unpopular, and there were a series of chats that were leaked that were highly offensive from his administration. Offensive in a sense that they belittled really the pain and suffering of people after the hurricane, especially the poorest people in Puerto Rico. And people took to the streets. There were also a lot of homophobic tweets that came out and messages that were leaked. A lot of stuff that was highly offensive. And hundreds of thousands of people took to the street to demand the resignation of the governor. So the Ricky Renuncia became like, the cry in the street. And what you see a lot in these photographs, in photographs like these, is the emergence of the black and white flag as a symbol of protest, right? That happens after Promesa in 2016. The black and white flag becomes a really popular symbol in the streets and also just in the culture at large of anti-colonial resistance against the Promesa Act and the colonial conditions imposed, but not just in 2016, but historically. I was in New York at the time, going back and forth to Puerto Rico a lot for various reasons with family, and post-hurricane was going back and forth a lot as well. But I'm also looking at the protests that are happening in the street in Puerto Rico. People are protesting the fiscal board. La Junta Fiscal, La Junta is the board, because they're meeting in Puerto Rico to decide how many schools to close, how many hospitals to close, how to squeeze the public debt in order to pay back the bondholders. And the people who are getting squeezed the most are the poorest citizens of the island. So this is what the protests looked like when people showed up to try to block the fiscal board from meeting. The May Day protests, again, you see the black and white flag again and again. And one of the largest impacts on the island and on the future of the island has been in education, because hundreds and hundreds of schools have been closed on the island in recent years. And so, fast forward here, sorry. For me, that's been the most devastating impact. Schools that will never open again. Over almost a third of the schools, public schools in Puerto Rico, have been closed with the reason of trying to sort of like satisfy this public debt, right, to reduce the debt. So during that time, I was thinking about ways to address that, and I came up with this sculpture that was incorporating the metal from decommissioned school buses and turning them into protest shields that would support the protesters that were very literally and very physically in the streets, right? Including teachers, students, families, people of all political stripes who were fighting to keep more schools from closing. Because this was happening before the hurricane, because of the debt, it was happening in mass after the hurricane. And this image on screen is of La Goico, which is a school in Santurce, Puerto Rico, which is one of my family's old hometowns, you could say. My grandfather went to this school. My great uncles and aunts went to this school. It was one of the many hundreds of schools that were closed. But this school was actually recovered and turned into a cultural center by local citizens. So it's one of the few success stories. The rest of the schools, many of them were destroyed after the hurricane. It's my time. Almost done. And driving throughout the island, this is what you would see in rural communities, in urban communities. And I would come across also like a lot of abandoned school buses. And so this was in Corozal, a rural town, and there were these like school bus graveyards there. And I approached the owner of the bus company about recycling some of the material from the buses. And so this is what the process looked like a little bit, where we stripped down these abandoned school buses. And they were literally abandoned because there were no more routes. There had been so many closures that they weren't worth fixing. We stripped them down. We cut them up, put wood backing on them, used a lot of recycled materials. This is all done in Puerto Rico. And eventually constructed these protest shields that were functional, but were really more symbolic. And so last year, about a year and a half ago, I got to show these at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It was the first ever show of contemporary Puerto Rican art at the Whitney. Not the first Puerto Rican art to show at the Whitney, but the first show dedicated exclusively to Puerto Rican artists. And it was called No Existe un Mundo Post-Huracán. There does not exist a post-hurricane world. Puerto Rican art in the wake of Hurricane Maria. So this was a huge, huge show for us. 20 artists, half from the island, half from the diaspora. And the first time that the Whitney is having this conversation about where Puerto Rico is in the landscape of its own mission, but also of American art at large. So this work has since been acquired by the National Gallery of Art, which I'm really excited about. And eventually this conversation will happen in DC. Hopefully in the months to come. This is the backside of those shields, where all of the shields line up in a banner. The other painting that I showed, Cunho, was acquired by the National Gallery of Art, and so at the same time that these shields were. So I mention that because it's exciting for me to think about these two moments in my own lifespan, right, within a generation, that represent the two largest historic moments of public protest. The largest public protests in Puerto Rico's history happened during Vieques and during the 2019 protests against the governor of Puerto Rico. So this is where we are, and I'm going to leave it here, but I want to just put this question on the table, or just a statement rather, is that when we showed at the Whitney, and after Hurricane Maria, there was a lot of conversation about, how devastating it was in Puerto Rico was felt by people all over the world. But one of the arguments made was that, how could this happen, right? How could we not support? They're American citizens, right? And we are. We're American citizens. 2017, we became citizens. But we're not just deserving of support because we're American citizens. We were deserving of support because we were suffering as colonized people of the United States, right? And as an island nation in the Caribbean. At the Whitney, it wasn't a proposal by the curator, Marcelo Guerrero, who was amazing, who was saying Puerto Ricans are Americans too, and therefore they belong in the Whitney Museum of American Art. It was more of a conversation that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, and it is part of this American project. And this is a good space for us to talk about that and negotiate. And all of the work in the show was really confronting these problematics. And it's a world that is still full of conflict and contradiction for us, but also a world that we're still negotiating very much. And what I loved about the show is it gave us all a platform to unpack these questions that we don't have easy answers to, but that we're all kind of navigating simultaneously. And that, for me, is something that institutions can do in a really interesting way, is put these difficult questions on the table for us as a public to sort of parse through. So with that, I thank you very much, and I will pass it on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Our third speaker is Marina Tikenko. Marina is the inaugural Ellen McColgan Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She's a Chamorro scholar who received her MA and PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and her BA from the University of Virginia. She has previously taught at Brown University and University of Pittsburgh. She has published articles in Feminist Studies, Panorama, Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, and Lateral, Journal of the Cultural Studies Association. Recent curatorial projects at the MFA include Marking Resilience, Indigenous North American Prints, a temporary exhibition co-curated with MFA curator Edward Saywell and artist Dwayne Slick, and A Little Bit of the Southwest, the first permanent gallery devoted to Native American art on the 20th century American floor of the American Wing at the MFA. Her independent curatorial projects include James Tyler from An Untouched Landscape at the George Eastman Museum and the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection. So please join me in welcoming Marina to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, so buenos and half a day, ina anhusi Marina Tikenko. Hello, my name is Marina Tikenko, and that's a little bit of my heritage language of Chamorro from Guam, which I'm still learning, or I'd give you more of it. But I'd just like to say thank you so much to Rachel and to the Addison and to the Lunder Institute for having me here today to talk about my work at the MFA. So as the program started today, I like to start most of my presentations with the land acknowledgement, and here I've shared both Philip's and also the MFA's. And the MFA's land acknowledgement, which I usually don't read but rather talk about, is meant to really invite Indigenous peoples and Native Americans to feel comfortable in our spaces. But also what, related to what I'll talk about more today, is that there are aspects of it that are actionable, particularly the idea of seeking ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. And also, if we're thinking about American art, negotiating our relationships with Indigenous peoples of the lands we occupy and also the collections we have is really an important place to start. So I'm so honored to speak here today, and I was invited in large part related to an essay that I co-wrote in Panorama titled Beyond Land Acknowledgements, which set out some work for what I hoped to do at the MFA right as I had received that position in 2021. And so this title, Beyond Land Acknowledgements, which I also probably could have titled this presentation, is really thinking about, how do we start from a place of acknowledgement and move into collaboration, consultation, cooperation, many different aspects of work. And it was also related to this project, which was just up for a few months in 2021, outside of the MFA, which was called Garden for Boston. It was made up of two different installations, growing installations, one by a Quinnawampanoag artist, Elizabeth James Perry, which is titled Raven Reshapes Boston. And this was actually a corn, beans, and squash garden around the Cyrus Dollins Appeal to the Great Spirit, a kind of mishmash of an indigenous man, which might have been based on an African-American model or an Italian model, but is a really prominent symbol of Native Americans that doesn't really represent any local communities. And then the other image shows the Garden for Boston project by Roxbury Native artist Equa Holmes, who kind of created Radiant Community, which was an offshoot of her project, her sunflower project around Boston, which really thought about beautifying and shaping her community. And I loved this project and this moment because the African American and Native American histories, in Massachusetts, in New England, and also just beyond, are very interconnected. And so this gave us a chance to really think and talk about those histories. As I said, this project was up for just a few months, but it's really been an important project for me in continuing to think about monuments, collaboration, and also working with Indigenous communities. Okay, so to shift the presentation of Native American art at the MFA, it's important to kind of figure out where we start or how Native American art has been historically presented at the MFA. And I was a little sad to see that we didn't speak to Rachel's presentation, but I was very happy that Andrew kind of set up so well the collection of Native American art at the MFA, which has actually been collected kind of continuously with the periods of deaccessioning, but starting in 1877. So very early in the founding was in 1870. So quite early in the MFA's history, we've been collecting Native American art. And at the time, it was a lot of ancient Native American art, or ancient Puebloan more specifically, but then also 19th century Zuni and other Pueblo works. So there's also a long history of collecting art that was contemporary at the time. But this slide shows the collection now is around 1,000 works, which represent many different regions and communities, with a strength in Southwest Native pottery, which a lot of Northeastern and East Coast museums have, I think, because of just the different kind of colonial projects, but also the idea that pottery kind of easily can slate into a decorative arts department, so it's kind of more easily understood as a kind of art and something that would be in an art museum. And this is also part of the collection that has been continuous and hasn't left. And so I'd just also like to acknowledge, so on the left is, yes, the left is a few images from 2003 when our Native American collection was near the Egyptian galleries. And I also just always want to thank my colleagues who have been at the MFA for much longer than I have been for reminding me of things like where these galleries were placed before. And this image also, I think, is kind of helpful because there were a lot of curatorial champions over the years, people who kind of collected and were interested in Native American art before there was an individual curator. So I think it's also just important to kind of recognize that. And then as we've kind of been thinking about this question of where is American art, since 2010, Native American art has been part of the Art of the Americas wing. We are an Art of the Americas wing, which I will say, and my colleagues will say, is kind of more aspirational than fully realized, but we're working on it and on many things. But our Native American gallery is actually on our lower ground floor. And our other wing of the Art of the Americas is organized chronologically, starting with Ancient Americas and Native American, which also includes contemporary and always has. So I'm aware of that it's not purely fitting that chronological boundary, but it goes 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th. Okay. And so more recent changes that I've worked on have really been around light-sensitive rotations, which I think have been kind of alluded to in other presentations, but we also have a very old conservation department. And much of the Native American art and the art in our collection happens to be light-sensitive because it's things like textiles and basketry. But I think I show this slide to kind of present the idea that what you can't fully see, but we're really kind of moving towards a direction of building the collection with a focus on the Northeast, so on the lands that we're on, which is why I have this case of baskets, not basket case, to the right that you can see, which is really prominent in our space. It's kind of a large central gallery, and it also focuses quite prominently on Nipmuc community, so Western Massachusetts, state-recognized tribe, and the front left basket is actually by a named maker, Sarah Maria Arnold Cisco, who was a very important Nipmuc leader as well. So the label that you can see and you can read if you come to the gallery is as much about basket making as livelihood as about, you know, this particular maker as an important piece of her community. And then also on the left, you can see if you kind of look back, you can see that we have a few objects or a few kind of stands without objects. And that's related to the 2023 new regulations of NAGPRA. And we've elected to keep those areas empty because a lot of the work in this gallery I've inherited, and there were like different kinds of questions even in 2010 that people were thinking about. And so deep back, you can see a little white slip that's on one of the shelves, and that actually talks about our NAGPRA work, which has really continued through the hiring of our first full-time NAGPRA fellow in August 2023. And I made my bio quite long, so I've already mentioned a little bit of the Southwest in this, but this is our first gallery in the 20th century floor, which is our third floor. And like many other art museums, we are kind of negotiating between, we do have a contemporary department, but we also have an American department. And where does that fall when we've kind of built in this 20th century gallery? And so I actually oversee art from a lot of different departments, or that are housed in a lot of different departments. But this gallery has been really important to my work because it was really based on conversations between mostly Native Southwest women and kind of how we negotiated this space. And a little bit of the Southwest, I think, is a very, for those of you very familiar with the MFA, it's not a very MFA-y title. It's a little bit saying too much what it is and not including now. Please don't quote me on that. But it's kind of just like, it's pointing out that we have limitations, right? Which I think maybe to the average museum viewer is a little bit less important, but I also think that because we're such an important institution, it's important to also point out the gaps. And so we have a wonderful strength in Blackware pottery. We have really wonderful textiles and jewelry that are part of the collection. But here on the back wall, you can see the two paintings are by T.C. Cannon and Fritz Scholder, Native American artists who are not from the Southwest, but who studied there. So rather than having one of our wonderful George O'Keeffe's that we could show, you know, Taos and the Puebloan communities there, instead we're thinking about how the American Southwest influences other Native American artists, because this is something that has been happening for a long time as well. Okay. So moving to the 19th century, moving down a little bit, this is actually a floor that we have worked on a bit less, but I kind of show these because I think many of us are familiar with different models of integrating Native American objects into historically or chronologically themed galleries. So maybe this is a pair of moccasins next to a painting that includes moccasins. And so my colleague Leila Bermeo and I have really worked on many different forms of collaborations and consultations, and just conversations beyond myself are really a big part of my work. And so in this case, we have the loan of two wonderful indigenous garments, a Northern Arapaho dress, which you can see on the left, and then a fabulous Métis jacket, which I've chosen to show an image that really shows the front of it and it in context, but it has insane quill work on the back that's just really amazing. And so rather than thinking about a gallery that already existed, bringing some Indigenous objects into it. Instead here, we reorganized a 19th century gallery around these important loaned items. And a big part of the research and kind of setting the scene for this show was actually talking to Northern Arapaho and Métis community members about how they're understanding these materials. And the theme, so the title of my slide is also the title of the gallery, Art of Attire, Power, Status, and Gender. And one thing that's really important to note is that these were both made by women. They would have been made by women. And so I think there's also, like the Cyrus Dallin example that I pointed out outside of our building, there's kind of a tendency and an over depiction of Native American and Indigenous men, but a lot of the art that we associate with Native American art is actually made by women. And that was quite important to kind of both of these. So we're really thinking about gender both in its depiction of gender, but also in the gender of the makers. And so this gives you another sense of the installation where we have, things that you would expect to see in the MFA, wonderful Winslow Homers, wonderful portraits by William Morris Hunt, but they're kind of there to speak back to the Indigenous garments rather than the other way around. So that Métis jacket, Métis means mixed in French, and it refers to Cree, Ojibwe, French, and English peoples. And the form is actually, it's made of hide, and I mentioned that in St. Quill work that I did not show you, but it's in the form of a military jacket. And so this Civil War era portrait of actually a past soldier that you can see on the wall is quite a similar shape to that. So even in the form of the jacket and then its materials, it's really representing its community. And then, of course, you can see this wonderful portrait, another Hunt, of a woman in a very fancy silk dress. And one thing that we're really interested in with this space is how luxury and kind of opulence and, there's been some shows that use the word excess, but this idea that Indigenous clothing can be luxurious, can be expensive. Maybe now if you're thinking about collecting, but you weren't really considering that, or it hasn't really been shown a lot in that way in the space. And so Venetian beads that traveled all the way to Wyoming would have been very expensive. And the estimates on this dress are over 2,500 Venetian beads. So if you can imagine acquiring that many beads from that far away, this would have also been an item of spiritual and community power, like very important, but additionally it would have been incredibly expensive to make. Okay, so moving on, and this is obviously where we're talking about the kind of now. I'm on the now panel. But this is a recently closed exhibition at the MFA in Boston titled Marking Resilience. And I think that the slow growth of institutions is true, but collections can grow. And I've found great success in collaborating with the chair of the print department, Edward Saywell, in growing our print department. It's large, but growing specifically Native American and Indigenous prints. And so this exhibition and the next one really celebrate that initiative, which has been over 70 prints since 2022, which also really increased the number of named Indigenous artists in the collection. But most importantly, the most important collaborator, even though Edward is fabulous, was the artist Dwayne Slick, who's a professor at RISD, a Squawky and Ho-Chunk artist who is in a bunch of exhibitions and collections as well. But he's also a professor of painting and printmaking. And so he brought actually the theme of resilience, but also personal knowledge of a lot of these artists. So it was just really wonderful to be able to work with him. And the next exhibition, I love an exhibition plan, especially one that I don't make because they're much better. So this is something that will open later this month. What I'm quite excited about is actually a less visual part of it. So if you kind of look to the right, there's that little hallway area. That is our response area. It was very frequented. The Marking Resilience exhibition had a lot of responses there, and in this next iteration, we're actually working with Massachusetts at Ponkapog tribal members to come up with a question and also to think about place from their perspective. So that's really exciting to me because I think it is showing that way of making our land acknowledgement actionable, but also thinking about incorporating Indigenous perspectives beyond art specifically. And with that, I'll just say Sajus M'ase, or thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marina. Our final speaker today is someone who will be familiar to many of our Phillips Academy audience members, Stephanie Sparling-Williams, who held a dual appointment at the Addison and within the art department here at Phillips Academy. Stephanie is now the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum. Her curatorial practice is predicated on interdisciplinary research, writing, and teaching on American art and foregrounds Black feminist space making. Her scholarly work is invested in the space of the museum with a focus on African American art and culture, and the work of US-based artists of color. Related interests include material histories, cross-cultural exchange, strategies of address, and contemporary art that engages with the history of the United States. Without further ado, please welcome to the stage Stephanie Sparling-Williams.
Thank you so much, and for everybody for being here on this Sunday. I just want to also thank the Addison and the Lunder Institute, the organizers of this program, Rachel, Ali, for this invitation. I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation and be back here with my forever family at the Addison and Phillips Academy. And for those of you who are here, sharing in this conversation with us, I'm truly honored and grateful. I have my timer. So I took the helm of the American Art Department at the Brooklyn Museum on December 1st, 2021, and worked with colleagues, many of them here on the screen, to chart a new vision, a set of collection strategies and initiatives, and to rebuild the department, which had seen a complete turnover prior to my arrival. Ultimately, it was clear when I was being brought on board that I had a high priority first assignment: to reimagine and reinstall the 9 historic gallery spaces that make up the museum's American Art Wing. So I got to work. This would not be my first rodeo. However, I think Beyonce just brought that back, right, for us? So we've been here before. My very first encounter with such a charge was actually shortly after my arrival on the East Coast in 2016, when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Yale University Art Gallery. There, I met and became fast friends with then American art curator Keely Orgeman, and soon after connected with Mark Mitchell, who is still the head of the American Art Department at the gallery. And Mark had also recently arrived, and together with Keely, they were in the process of reinstalling Yale's American art collection. At the time, I was teaching in their galleries, and they generously offered a front row seat to their process. It was from that vantage that I observed the real nuts and bolts of curatorial work within collections for the very first time. A few years later, I would find myself reinstalling, oh, I missed one. Fast forward, but not that fast, was my first actual curatorial role, which was here at the Addison Gallery of American Art, where my very first project, actually, upon arriving, was to reinstall the Addison's important collection on the occasion of my teaching a course on American art at Phillips Academy and also at UMass Lowell. I was coming in only months before the wonderful Susan Faxon would retire, and while I kept the galleries rather traditionally in a chronological order, I did so in provocation of the collection's gaps, many of which mirrored the entire art historical field and the histories I would go on to teach. A few years later, I would find myself reinstalling the Mount Holyoke College Art Museum's encyclopedic collection, not just the American galleries, which had not been reorganized since the 1970s. And unfortunately, I left before I could realize those plans, because that's exactly when Ann Pasternak called me. I say this all by way of introduction because American art and collection reinstallations have been at the center of my career and my teaching for the past 8-9 years. And even in the years before that, I, along with so many colleagues in the field, have been preoccupied with this question about the nature of, the definition of, and perhaps even the ontology of American art. I taught classes, like I said, as these provocations for years. What is America? What is American art? And I studied the canon from the margins inward, from the center out. And much of this work is what led to my coming to the Brooklyn Museum, but admittedly, I've long grown tired of these questions about definitions and boundaries. And perhaps because no matter how I framed them, they always hinged on value, on charting different borders around the same exact house, the same property and substance, or in today's culture speak, the same core stories. So in the fall of 2024, and coinciding with the Brooklyn Museum's 200th anniversary, I'll just say that again, 200 years. So I think we haven't been mentioned quite yet, but 1824, 23-ish, the Brooklyn Museum started as a lending library that exhibited art. And then our first art commissions were in 1855, Asher B. Durand, Daniel Huntington. So we have a really long history of collecting American art. American art was our founding collection. So it's a really exciting legacy to be a part of. So coinciding with this huge 200th anniversary year and the programming, we in the American Art Department at the Brooklyn Museum will be asking a different set of questions with our collection. And the first really is, how might we experience the collection today? To which each gallery in the reinstallation will be one bold yet tender response after another, joyfully, wondrously, and with a great sense of curiosity. And the second question is really a lingering probe. With our Transform galleries, we will be conducting a massive experiment in an attempt to really push the boundaries of representation within the field. What do I mean by that? Well, I think there's been, frankly, this uncomfortable obsession in this moment with representation, which I'm not here to argue its importance. Representation is important, full stop, period. What this fixation has often translated, though, as into the representation of the Black body, particularly, and its physical products, of the Native body and their physical products, of the brown body and its physical products, and the myriad of other previously marginalized bodies and their products across histories of American art based on color, sexuality, gender, ability, and the list really goes on. And it's tricky because we are an art and cultural institution. We're art and cultural historians. So our work is concerned with objects and with materials, belongings, and creative products. However, this concern or critique that I'm articulating is, of course, compounded by other factors, such as the aforementioned people who have been marginalized and their work having had historically and contemporarily limited and varied access to the modes of production, and the very real time constraints that we're also working within of a collection in any single individual or group of curators to radically reorient and remake its historical presentation, especially one built over 200 years. And let alone to do this one in the span of one's career and with the speed at which the demands are being lobbied, current social, cultural, and political landscape today. So I often give this when I'm talking to students. We talked about how collection building happens very slowly, and I say this when I realize, and they realize too, that I could literally collect work only made by Black women for the rest of my career with my current resources and never achieve parity within my 200-year-old collection. So we've got to work in different we've got to work differently, right? We're absolutely building urgently a collection toward greater parity, but we have to do more than just add, right, and stir to the collection we have. So what I'm emphasizing, or what I'm going to emphasize with the remainder of my time today about our new direction at the museum are priorities and a set of ideas. Our prioritizing the experiences of our audiences within our collection galleries and the advancement of ideological contributions of previously marginalized communities as framing devices for the objects therein. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, moving away from the popular practice of positioning previously marginalized and underappreciated art and material culture in relationship to any pre-existing narrative or canonical understanding of American art history, which has already been kind of critiqued throughout our other panels today. This includes major styles and movements. Our team is really taking up a myriad of lenses, a myriad of frameworks that are, yes, emerging out of Black and women of color feminist traditions, as well as queer of color culture and critique to create fresh experiences with historical art for our diverse audiences. So on October 4th, 2024, mark your calendars, we will be reopening a trailblazing presentation of our American art collection, which will include 120 never-before exhibited works straight from storage, and bring together extraordinary artworks and belongings that span 6,000 years, and 9 of the museum's 11 departments. So happy to ask questions about that math. And really what we're offering here is fresh encounters with work and material culture from across the Western Hemisphere. So that came up earlier, how museums are thinking about their collections. That really isn't our collection or how the American art collection is delineated, but that's how we're thinking about our display and how you'll experience the collections. And we'll really use this display to disrupt traditional approaches to collection display by foregrounding these approaches that come out of Black feminisms to institutional critique and really thinking about how we create spaces differently. So each gallery will be dedicated to particular frameworks that are adapted from a range of diverse cultural lenses, as I mentioned, and they hold specific significance to BIPOC people rather than perpetuating or privileging a Western canonical lens. And this is that experiment in representation that I was talking about. These frameworks are going to facilitate dialogue between arts spanning North, Central, and South America and across time, culture, and medium. So shifting the focus away from European, American-centric knowledge production and dissemination, we're really trying to affirm and uplift the worldviews of historically marginalized artists and craftspeople, their subjects, audiences, and also in direct responses to the ongoing critiques that confirm the violence that many of our museum visitors experience as a result of our current framing. So a lot of institutions in the past 3 to 5 years have been doing a lot of audience engagement surveys. They've been doing a lot of focus groups. They've been doing a lot of advisory committees, and the Brooklyn Museum has certainly benefited from those things as well that are forming not only the framing, but informing how we're thinking about the visitor experience. So I'm just going to close by sharing 3 focused innovations of this curatorial approach to kind of maybe put some more color to it. So first, the Brooklyn Museum's collection presentation will move away from past organizational modes, which have included, like I was mentioning earlier, chronology, style and major movements or schools, medium-specific installation, and of course the thematic display. For me, thematic displays have typically involved a grouping of artworks that are brought together under a particular topic or focus. They allow you to do a lot of really great things with different and disparate objects, artworks, and belongings. What we are moving toward in the American Art Department at the Brooklyn Museum is the use of frameworks, which is distinctly about what is done with the artworks once they are brought together. So frameworks are really about organizing ideas and actions. The display is really just the beginning of that work. Essentially, through the use of frameworks, what we are building is the space, the structure, the home in which our curatorial thought work and the care work that we're going to be doing with our collection can flourish. The second major field intervention, in this project is its methodological underpinning, which, as I mentioned before, is Black feminist thought. Part of what makes Black feminist thought work and practice so innovative is the way it has historically drawn upon the lived experiences of the most marginalized to inform and chart new possibilities that support and uplift those very individuals. Black feminisms are inherently interdisciplinary, and in my practice, and I'm hopeful for the future of the American Art Department at the Brooklyn Museum, ever growing, ever evolving, to meet the just demands of our previously excluded and underserved audiences specifically. So when you hear Black feminist thought, Black feminist approaches, what we're really talking about is a theoretical and practical orientation toward the curatorial work itself, and a human, embodied, care-centered orientation toward our audiences. We are building display structures that give us the room to boldly experiment with representation, to practice radical care, and to be attentive to the language of political demand, ultimately, creating those much-needed bridges between contemporary audiences and our historic art collections. which leads me to my final innovation that I'll highlight tonight, or in this context today, which is the experiential reprioritization that this reinstallation performs. What I mean by this is that this project shifts away from traditional knowledge production and delivery or transfer in our galleries to focus on how our galleries feel to our viewers, who have historically found themselves uninterested at best, or worst, harmed, triggered, or traumatized. Toward this end, we are prioritizing experiences of joy, inspired curiosity, and a fair amount of disorientation. And when I say joy here, I could talk for an hour about joy, and this is a rigorous possibility for how we think about, I think a student asked about how do we decolonize collections, and I'm actually really interested in thinking about how we reorient collections. I think that's something that feels a lot more attainable and feasible. And joy, see me on my lecture on joy, but I just wanted to signpost that there because I don't want to flatten it by just saying joy, because I don't mean happy and I don't mean happiness. It's much more rigorous. And when we think about how we cultivate joy in the face of exclusion and suffering. So understandably, the last thing I mentioned, disorientation, really feels counterintuitive. But this is actually so incredibly important to me because the museum, and particularly these American art galleries, have historically been oriented towards white supremacy. So any successful display that seeks to upend, shift, work against, combat, and depart from white supremacy will necessarily need to reorient. If our galleries do not feel different, or even strange to those conditioned to experience displays of American art in particular ways, myself included, I think we would have failed. So how do we know whether we're on the right track? Whether we're actually accomplishing the work we set out to do in these galleries? Well, one incredible and impactful way has been through a Terra-sponsored Black Feminist Roundtable, which was monthly convened, and it was a group of interdisciplinary thought partners doing work at the intersections. They're doing work in the intersections of their own field and Black feminist thought. And they came together for the past 10 months to review and provide feedback on each of the frameworks, and with the expressed goal of bringing them to their most rigorous fruition, a peer review. And what I've learned over the course of my work on this project, which admittedly has not been very long, is that it's the dual transformation, right, for me. It's the display and the methodology. I found that actually I have no interest in producing yet another reinstallation of a collection of American art if it does not both shift people's experiences of these historic artworks while also reconceptualizing how we as curators do our work in the first place. So I'll end there. Thank you. Shameless plug, quickly, sorry. I have recently, at much pressure and mostly from my mom, been posting the journey on Instagram. So if you have Instagram and you want to see like before and after images, you want to follow in the install this summer, I've been posting like short kind of little bits. I'm new. I'm obviously on my way to being an influencer. I've got 2,000 followers, but I'm new, so be patient. Like I said, it's for my mom, but please follow along if you're interested. Thank you.
You've already heard me speak enough, so please, if there are questions in the audience, and I know we're sort of running up against our 4:30 reception deadline, but please feel free to pose them if you have any. But one thing, and this was thank you so much to all of the panelists on both panels, and particularly this panel was so generative and offered so much food for thought that there must be questions out there. But one that I'm really interested in is, and tying it back to Thomas Cochrane and his aim of inspiring a love for the beautiful. And and providing an environment for students to learn about aesthetics and beauty. Do you think there's a role for beauty and aesthetics in our current moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. I mean,
it wasn't a trick. I'm just curious because I'm so much about methodology and frameworks, and I wonder, where does the historic work of art fit into this conversation, or the work of art in general?
I mean, I think it's how we define sort of the aesthetics and beauty, and it's the same thing. Like, I'm really interested in how the conversation of joy and beauty and how that can be sort of like rearticulated, because I think the frameworks for those evaluations when it comes to historic works of art, not just American art, but in general, right, versus contemporary practices, there's a big range, and of interpretation. And so I think for me, one of the most exciting things that's been happening is thinking about how frameworks are shifting, right? And how that can happen when you have interlocutors at institutions that can open up these conversations, who are connected to the communities that they're engaging with, right? And this is happening slowly, but happening, right? And so, but I just have my perspective sort of on thinking of beauty and aesthetics in object making, right? Because there's still a huge part of my practice and in my relationship to art as a maker is that the surface is still the first kind of the first experience, right? The first level of engagement. And one of my fascinations with the surface and making things that are shiny and bright and that pop off is that it's a draw, right? It's a hook. And I generally love doing those kinds of things, but once you have people there, you can sometimes offer a conversation that is less expected or is different. So there is a disorientation that can also happen through the way that we think of beauty and attraction and seduction through a visual kind of experience to surface. I'm thinking of it as a sculptor and a painter in that way.
I think a lot about this because I think when we have these American art collections, in institutions, we're really, that's part of our charge is stewarding, cultivating spaces for beauty and beautiful artworks. But I have to wonder, what do you do when those beautiful artworks are tied up or enmeshed or entangled in these ugly and often violent histories? And I think, often because they are tangled up in these violent and often ugly histories, different people have different access to them, And so they're beautiful for maybe some audiences, but then just being in the space for others, doesn't allow them access, because there's so many other things happening. And so I think that holding that beauty in tension with everything else that comes with it, like how do you give access to that beauty? It's like, it's not just inherently beautiful. So I think, or if we do believe it's inherently beautiful, how do we make sure all audiences can experience beauty when they come into the museum?
Do we have any questions out there?
Hi, this question's for Marina, and I'm wondering if you can maybe share a bit about how you're thinking about repatriation in some of these contexts. I know it's probably a daunting task to work in an institution that has an encyclopedic look at these concepts of what is American. But with land acknowledgements and all of that, I don't know if that's part of your thinking when categorizing some of these works.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that question. So all U.S. institutions that receive federal funding are subject to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was established in 1990 and was just updated in 2023, which is why I was showing the slide of certain objects being removed. So it's a really important part of the work I do. I mentioned that we have a NAGPRA fellow. They report to me, and I made their job description and also was able to kind of help find funding for it. It's a really important part because not just working with local communities, but also all of the indigenous communities whose belongings we house, I think as we're thinking about, or as I'm continuing to think about shifting other spaces, or particularly the permanent galleries, there's always a question of like, is our house in order? And we're getting closer to there. I will say compliance of a federal law is ongoing. And it's also not the same thing as curatorial work, which is why we hired someone who has a master's degree in NAGPRA work, in museum studies with an emphasis on anthropology. But I think it's important for a large institution to kind of decouple those things. So of course, I'll always be interested in repatriation and understand what's the status of every item in the collection. But there are entire programs devoted to learning how to do this work specific to the United States. And at a large museum like the MFA, we also have people who have worked on repatriation for our global collections for decades. So this is something that we kind of have. We have a very high standard of provenance for any object in the collection. But of course, things that came in, most of the collection of Native American art was gifted, and many of it, is listed as Lakota or like possibly Plains. And so we're doing a lot of different things, in terms of reporting, but also just in terms of kind of understanding our collection better. So it's very much a part of the work that I do and what I'm thinking about. But also it's important for especially large institutions to understand the training is separate. Thank you.
On the question of NAGPRA and repatriation, perhaps one sort of related idea would be the idea of like ethnographic collections. And do you think there's a line between like ethnographic collections and collections in like art galleries? Or especially like when we think about like perhaps like more older pieces or pieces made by Indigenous Americans or Indigenous people in general?
So I think this one's also for me. Yeah. Okay, well, I can start. But I just want to say, again, thank you to Andrew for kind of setting me up a bit about this. The MFA has always been an art museum of fine arts. So we've always understood our collection to be arts focused. So the objects that that were not transferred to the Peabody at Harvard were mainly pottery. So a lot of what is the basis of the collection now, on the idea that they could, again, be understood as decorative arts, be understood as art. And I think that, of course, one of my favorite galleries actually in the MFA is our recent Dutch renovations, the Van Otterloo galleries, because there's an anthropological look at Europeans, which we could do more of, but also because it helps us to understand the Dutch world better, why these little tiny places became so globally important, hint slavery, but also just that, there's so much more going on in the world, and if we can take anthropological or ethnographic approaches to European art, then it can help us understand those areas better. But for my spaces, what I really focus on is kind of how communities understand these items and who the makers are and kind of what those processes would have been. And a lot of that is related to, research with Indigenous scholars and also just conversations, which is a big part of my practice. So it's not like there's no place for it, because I think anthropology and ethnography often get a bad rap, but they were looking at Indigenous arts much earlier than art historians were, and I think we can't ignore that. And also, a lot of that work was actually done in conversation with community. Even if it was done for an extremely racist, sexist, everythingist lens, some of these practices are, ethnography is based on the writing and ideas of having conversations, and that's part of my practice now, right? Thank you. Yeah.
This sort of division between what might, traditional Indigenous versus contemporary Indigenous came up over and over again, and I only kind of was able to touch on it briefly, but there were some really interesting questions that arose in the way that, these divisions, the complexity of these divisions. So in some cases, typically, this has to do, again, with expertise and training, that there are different forms of, there are different methodologies for treating this material, but it would be the case that, an Art of the Ancient Americas department would hold material up to the 19th century, and then work by those same group of people in the 20th and 21st century would be in a different department, which has implications for, creating a this division that's based around European contact, when practices are in many ways continuations of the same, they have the same perhaps ritual function, or they're engaging with the same traditions. And so this kind of arbitrary break is just one of the complexities about how departments are dealing with these things. And then there's the kind of inverse situation at the Met where their chronological division for American art ends in 1950, but they collect contemporary indigenous art, which raises the question of, what does it mean? In many ways, these works can be powerful interlocutors. They can, be deployed in ways that really intervene in historical narratives. But at the same time, what does it mean to say that these groups of works are not modern and contemporary, or not placed in dialogue with modern and contemporary collections? So I think there are a lot of kind of interest, even though I understand and tried to reference in my presentation that these divisions are sometimes arbitrary, that they're not necessarily reflective of how things are installed in the galleries. I think they're really interesting questions that end up arising from the way that material is sort of treated and how that indicates sort of certain implications or questions that we have to reckon with when we think about what we mean by American art more broadly.
Probably time for one more question, if there is one out there. I see some hands.
So thank you all. It's such a great way in which you have discussed the way in which your institutions and your curatorial practices or artistic practices are trying to question some of these frameworks and practices that are in place, and the way in which you're wrapping your audience participation into that and asking the audience to rethink that. So this is really a question for Stephanie, mostly because I'm sort of amazed by the bravery of your challenge of disorienting the visitor and thinking about, again, what Andrew has set us up for about the way in which curatorial practice and sets up the viewer, sets a kind of framework. And so how are you thinking about disorienting as being a universal experience? If we think about aesthetic experiences as not being universal, how can you, how are you setting up disorienting so that it will disorient all visitors? Or is that a challenge you're setting for yourself?
I don't think so. I think disorienting the field, certainly, or disorienting how we might expect these galleries to look and feel. I will say that the Brooklyn Museum's audience is pretty distinct. We have one of the most, I think we have the most diverse audiences in the world in terms of sheer numbers, sheer representations of communities who come in to the museum, who use the museum as resources, as a site for protest and active. I mean, I think there's somebody's full-time job at the museum that does these kinds of statistics that have been really helpful to understand who our audience is, which I think a lot of museums are starting to get into that research. And we found that our audiences are very unique, but also have been demanding a lot more from us for decades. And I think the American art and the rest of our staff too. So I really understood quite palpably when I came in that things had to change, and they had to feel and look, and they just needed to. It really felt very apparent that this was what was needed. So I think on the large hand, our audiences have been asking for change for a long time, and I think they're ready for change in these galleries. So I think when it comes to disorienting, I don't think disorienting is inherently a negative experience. I think that, in fact, for a lot of our audiences, it'll be hopefully what they've been asking for, to have different kinds of engagement, or just to notice our galleries. Right now, if you're familiar with the Brooklyn Museum's fifth floor American art kind of donut or wing, it moves around our historic Beaux-Arts court, even though you can't see the courtyard from the galleries themselves, but it's also on the way to most of our special exhibition spaces. And so we've become kind of a hallway or a pass-through to what people actually come to the museum to see. And people kind of wander around. I spend a lot of time actually watching our audience in the collection galleries, and you can tell that they kind of float around in a way that feels disengaged, or then we get the surveys, and then we hear pretty explicitly that they're bored, or it's uninteresting, or why are we looking at these things? Why are they collected? And it's not because our collection isn't amazing. The collection's amazing, but how do we present it in a way that connects with contemporary visitors and actually the way that they're used to experiencing culture right now? I think the framework model that the experience in every single gallery is entirely different and separate from each other really lends itself. And again, I'm very careful to say, this is how I want to experience or how I want to experiment with American art now. And the Addison actually really taught me this model. The fact that they're constantly moving the collection and engaging in different ways really sets up, kind of gave me the permission throughout my career to keep things moving. And the framework model also allows us to respond, in the moment, because if at any given point that there's something in our cultural landscape that we want to respond, or we want to use the collection to present new research or some innovation, one framework gets picked out and then another framework. I mean, there are 30 frameworks that didn't make it, but it allows us to move in. And other institutions are actually moving toward this model. So if you all are following LACMA's rebuild and reorg that's happening, I think it's 2026, it's going to sound very familiar. This idea that collections are much more nimble and we can use them. So I think this is riffing off of your question of orientation. I don't think everybody's going to experience the disorientation the same. And I think actually a lot of people might be really upset, But one thing that I know about Andrew's, or what Andrew's work has really inspired me, is the permission that exhibitions have served different purposes at different points in history. From wild curiosities to nearly almost like a circus, like performers and botanicals and these extravagant displays. And I think we can be a little bit more daring. I think the White Cube is a period room. It's a period room. The White Cube that now we subscribe to as like the perfect way to view all art was not how most of the artists in my collections were actually creating work for. Like, they weren't creating work for the White Cube. They were creating work for the home, patrons, the salons. They were creating work in these different contexts, and I'm borrowing from a lot of exhibition history strategies that I think will delight and inspire, hopefully, our contemporary audiences as well. So that answered your question.
Yeah, on that fantastic note, let's please give a round of applause to all of our presenters. And thank you again so much to the Lunder Institute and to the Colby Museum of Art for sponsoring this incredible program.